They said she was carrying a child out of wedlock. In 1875 Colorado, that accusation was a death sentence for any respectable woman. Eleanor Whitmore stood in the town square, surrounded by pointing fingers and whispered condemnations, her life crumbling with every passing second. Then he stepped forward, Caleb Rourke, the territory's most feared rancher, and spoke 5 words that stopped every heart. If she carries, it's mine. What happened next would become the most talked about love story in Red Hollow's history. Stay with me until the end of this tale and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor and Caleb's story travels across the world. The morning of September 14th, 1875 began like any other in Red Hollow, Colorado. The sun rose over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, promising a beautiful autumn day. Eleanor Whitmore woke in her small room above the general store, braided her chestnut hair with practiced efficiency, and dressed in her modest blue cotton dress, the one with the white collar she'd embroidered herself during the long winter nights. She had no way of knowing that before the day ended, her entire life would be shattered by a lie. Eleanor was 26 years old, which made her practically a spinster by the town's standards, though she'd never much cared about that particular designation. She had her work, her dignity, and her independence, 3 things she valued far more than a husband who might restrict all 3. For 4 years, she'd served as Red Hollow's school teacher, educating children from ages 6 to 16 in reading, arithmetic, history, and moral philosophy. She took pride in her work, perhaps more pride than was entirely proper for a woman, but Eleanor had never been one to apologize for her competence. She descended the narrow stairs from her room, nodded politely to Mrs. Henderson at the store counter, and stepped out onto Main Street. The town was already stirring to life. Mr. Peterson was opening his barber shop, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. She loved this town, despite its flaws and gossips. Red Hollow had been her home since she'd arrived from Boston 4 years ago, fleeing memories she preferred not to revisit. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a white clapboard building with a bell tower that Eleanor rang every morning at precisely 8 o'clock. She arrived early, as always, to prepare the day's lessons. She was writing arithmetic problems on the blackboard when she heard the first whisper. It came from outside, 2 women's voices, just loud enough to carry through the open window. "Quite certain. That's a very serious accusation, Constance." "I know what I saw, Margaret. The signs are unmistakable. My own mother had 7 children. I know a woman in the family way when I see one." Eleanor's hand stilled on the blackboard, chalk dust settling on her fingers. She told herself they must be discussing someone else, some unfortunate girl who'd found herself in trouble. Red Hollow saw such scandals every few years. A hasty wedding, a baby born premature, but somehow perfectly healthy, whispered speculation about exactly when the vows had been exchanged. "But Miss Whitmore? I can hardly believe it. She's always been so proper, so respectable." The chalk snapped in Eleanor's hand. "The proper ones are often the worst." Constance Bradley's voice came clearly through the window, dripping with malicious satisfaction. "All that righteousness is just a mask. I've suspected for weeks now. She's been looking peaked, and I've seen her leaving church early 3 Sundays in a row, claiming headaches. And you know what else? She's been letting out her dresses. I saw her at the seamstress last week, and Mrs. Porter was taking out the waist of her good Sunday dress." "Letting out her dresses?" Margaret's voice held shock and fascination in equal measure. "But if she's... Who could the father be? She's not courting anyone." "Exactly." Constance's voice lowered conspiratorially, but Eleanor could still hear every word. "Which means it's someone she shouldn't be with. Probably a married man. Why else would she hide it?" Eleanor stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. This couldn't be happening. It was absurd, impossible. She wasn't with child. She'd let out her dress because she'd been eating more. Mrs. Henderson's son had returned from Denver, and his mother had been cooking elaborate meals, often sending leftovers to Eleanor's room. She'd left church early because she genuinely had headaches, brought on by the stress of managing 32 students with varying abilities and her own private financial worries. But even as her rational mind cataloged these explanations, her stomach dropped with the realization that none of them would matter. In a town like Red Hollow, truth was less important than perception. A rumor, once started, took on a life of its own. She should go outside, confront them, deny it immediately. But her legs wouldn't move. She stood there listening to her reputation being destroyed, word by venomous word. Someone should speak to Reverend Walsh, Margaret was saying. A woman in her position teaching our children. I've already mentioned it to him, Constance said smugly. And to the school board. They'll want to address this immediately. We can't have a woman of loose morals instructing our daughters in virtue. Eleanor finally found her voice, but before she could move toward the door, she heard the sound of running feet and children's voices. Her students were arriving. She glanced at the clock. 5 minutes until 8. She rang the bell with shaking hands and watched as children filed in, some curious about her pale face, most simply chattering about their morning adventures. She taught that day in a haze, hearing her own voice as if from a great distance, explaining long division and the causes of the Revolutionary War. At noon, when the children scattered for their lunch break, Eleanor sat at her desk and tried to think clearly. She needed to address this, to deny the rumor before it spread further. But whom should she tell? The Reverend? The school board? Constance Bradley herself? The decision was taken out of her hands when, at 2 o'clock, the schoolhouse door opened and Reverend Walsh entered, followed by 3 members of the school board: Harold Pritchard, owner of the general store, Samuel Blackwood, the town's lawyer, and Thomas Crawford, who ran the livery stable. "Children," Reverend Walsh said, his voice heavy with false kindness, "you're dismissed early today. Go straight home to your parents." Eleanor watched her students file out, some confused, others excited by the unexpected holiday. When the last child had gone, the door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. "Miss Whitmore," Reverend Walsh began, settling his considerable bulk into one of the student desks with a grimace, "we've received some very disturbing information." Eleanor stood behind her desk, using it as a shield. "I believe I know what you're going to say, and I assure you, please let us speak first." Harold Pritchard held up a hand. He looked uncomfortable, unable to meet her eyes. "There are rumors circulating about your condition, about your moral character." "Rumors spread by Constance Bradley," Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Rumors that are completely false. I am not with child. I have done nothing improper." "Nevertheless," Samuel Blackwood said, and his lawyer's voice was cool, measured, utterly without sympathy. "The rumor exists, and in a town like Red Hollow, perception is reality. Parents are already concerned about allowing their children to be taught by someone whose reputation is questionable." "My reputation was spotless until this morning." Eleanor's voice rose despite her determination to remain calm. "I've dedicated 4 years to this town, to these children. I've never given anyone cause to question my character." "There's also this matter of your situation," Thomas Crawford added. He at least had the grace to look ashamed. "An unmarried woman, living alone, no family in the territory. It's irregular. It makes people wonder." "It makes people gossip," Eleanor corrected bitterly, "which is different from wondering." "Be that as it may," Reverend Walsh said, "we have a duty to protect the moral education of Red Hollow's youth. Until this matter is resolved, we believe it's best if you step away from your teaching duties." The room seemed to tilt around Eleanor. "You're dismissing me, based on a lie?" "We're suspending you," Pritchard said quickly. "Temporarily. Until we can investigate." "Investigate what?" Eleanor demanded. "Whether or not I'm pregnant? Shall I submit to examination by Dr. Morrison? Would that satisfy you? Shall I parade myself before the town and prove my innocence?" The 4 men shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of unpleasant female emotion they'd been hoping to avoid. "That won't be necessary," Blackwood said stiffly. "But until the gossip dies down, your presence in the classroom would be disruptive." "The gossip will never die down if you treat it as though it has merit." Eleanor could hear the desperation in her own voice and hated it. "Don't you see? By suspending me, you're confirming the rumor. You're telling the entire town that you believe I'm guilty." "We're telling the town that we take such matters seriously," Reverend Walsh said. "Your salary will continue for the next 2 weeks while we deliberate on the best course of action, but for now, please clear your personal belongings from the schoolhouse." They left her there, standing in the empty classroom surrounded by the evidence of her work, The alphabet chart she'd painted, the globe she'd purchased with her own money, the neat rows of slates waiting for tomorrow's lessons. Lessons she wouldn't be teaching. Eleanor gathered her few belongings mechanically. A shawl, a book of poetry, a small tin of tea she kept in her desk for cold mornings. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the shawl around her shoulders. As she stepped out of the schoolhouse, she saw that a crowd had gathered in the street. Word had spread with the terrifying speed that scandal always traveled in small towns. Women clustered in groups of 3 and 4, their heads bent together, their eyes cutting toward Eleanor with a mixture of pity and condemnation. Men loitered outside the saloon and the mercantile, pretending not to watch, but missing nothing. Even children had been caught up in the drama, whispering and pointing. Eleanor walked down Main Street toward the general store where her room waited, and the crowd parted before her like the Red Sea. But unlike Moses' miracle, this parting was born not of divine favor, but of revulsion, as though her mere presence might contaminate those near her. "Shameful," someone muttered. "Teaching our children," another voice whispered, "and all the while, someone ought to run her out of town." Eleanor kept her chin up, her eyes forward, even as tears burned in her throat. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. She'd done nothing wrong. She'd lived a blameless life. And yet here she was, being destroyed by pure fiction, powerless to defend herself because the truth was somehow less compelling than a well-told lie. She was halfway down the street when Constance Bradley stepped directly into her path. Constance was 45 years old, thin as a rail, with sharp features that matched her sharp tongue. She'd lived in Red Hollow her entire life and considered herself the arbiter of the town's morals, a responsibility she took very seriously and exercised with great enthusiasm. She wore black, as she had since her husband's death 3 years prior, and she carried herself with the righteous authority of a woman who knew God was on her side. "Miss Whitmore," she said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear, "I think it's time you told the truth. Who is the father of your child?" The street went silent. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel dozens of eyes burning into her. "There is no child," Eleanor said, her voice remarkably steady. "There is no father. There is only your lie, Mrs. Bradley." "I know what I see," Constance said, her eyes glittering with malice. "And I see a woman who has fallen from grace, a woman who has betrayed the trust this town placed in her. The question is, who did you betray it with? Who is the man you've been meeting in secret?" "I haven't been meeting anyone. Someone saw you walking near the river last Tuesday evening," Constance pressed. "Alone? What respectable woman walks alone at dusk? I was collecting wildflowers for a botany lesson. Or meeting a lover. This is insane." Eleanor looked around at the crowd, searching for a friendly face, someone who might speak in her defense. But even those who'd been kind to her over the years now looked away, unwilling to associate themselves with scandal. "You're all insane. You'd rather believe a vicious lie than consider that one of your own might be spreading falsehoods." "I have never lied in my life," Constance said, drawing herself up indignantly. "I have a duty to this community to speak the truth, no matter how unpleasant." "Your duty is to destroy anyone who doesn't bow to your authority," Eleanor shot back. "You've done this before, haven't you? To Sarah Brennan, to Martha Cole, any woman who threatens your position as Red Hollow's moral guardian." A murmur went through the crowd. Eleanor had touched a nerve. Both women she'd named had left town under clouds of scandal, rumors spread by Constance that had never been proven but had been believed nonetheless. But before Constance could respond, before Eleanor could press her advantage, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "If she carries, it's mine." The crowd turned as one, and Eleanor felt her heart stop. Caleb Rourke stood at the edge of the crowd, tall and unmistakable, his weathered face partially shadowed by the brim of his black Stetson. He was 34 years old, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, and a man whose presence commanded immediate attention. He'd built his fortune from nothing, starting as a ranch hand at 16 and now controlling thousands of acres and hundreds of head of cattle. He was respected, feared, and envied in equal measure, and he had just claimed responsibility for Eleanor's non-existent pregnancy. The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he'd just said. She'd met Caleb Rourke exactly 3 times in 4 years. Once when he'd delivered a horse to the school for the children to learn about animal care. Once when she'd bumped into him at the general store. Once when she'd seen him in church, though he rarely attended services. They'd never had a conversation longer than 5 minutes. They were barely acquaintances, and he'd just announced to the entire town that he was the father of her child. Caleb walked forward, his boots making solid, deliberate sounds on the wooden boardwalk. The crowd parted for him as it had for Eleanor, but differently, with deference rather than disgust. When he reached her side, he looked down at her with those steady gray eyes, and Eleanor saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not apology, not uncertainty, determination. "Mr. Rourke," Constance Bradley recovered first, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Are you saying that you and Miss Whitmore have been involved?" "I'm saying that if there's a child, it's mine," Caleb repeated. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as though he were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "And that being the case, there's no scandal here, just a wedding that's overdue." Eleanor found her voice. "Mr. Rourke, you don't have to—" "I know what I have to do, Miss Whitmore." He looked at her, and something in his expression silenced her protest. "The question is whether you'll accept my proposal." It wasn't a proposal, it was a rescue. And they both knew it. Eleanor looked at this crowd, at Constance Bradley's stunned face, at Reverend Walsh's expression of relief. Scandal resolved, propriety restored. She looked at the women who'd whispered about her, the men who'd judged her, the children who'd been pulled from her classroom as though she carried plague. And she looked at Caleb Rourke, this near stranger who'd just offered her his name, his protection, and his reputation. She didn't know why he was doing this. She didn't understand his motivation, but she understood that he was offering her a way out of an impossible situation. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." A collective exhale went through the crowd, tension releasing like a held breath. Constance Bradley looked as though she'd swallowed something bitter, but even she couldn't argue with this resolution. A man had claimed responsibility. A wedding would follow. The scandal was contained. Reverend Walsh hurried forward, suddenly all smiles and Christian charity. "Wonderful, wonderful. I can perform the ceremony this Sunday, if that's amenable to both parties. Mr. Rourke, Miss Whitmore, shall we step into the church and discuss the arrangements?" But Caleb shook his head. "We'll discuss arrangements, but not now. Miss Whitmore has had a difficult day." He offered Eleanor his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. "I'll escort her back to her room. We'll call on you tomorrow, Reverend." He led her through the crowd, which parted again, this time with whispers of a very different kind. "Caleb Rourke. Well, I never would have guessed. They must have been very discreet. Lucky woman, landing the richest rancher in the territory." Eleanor walked beside him in a daze, her hand on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve. He was real. This was happening. She just agreed to marry a man she didn't know, to escape a lie that should never have had power over her in the first place. When they reached the general store, Caleb opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Mrs. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, her eyes wide with curiosity and the fresh gossip she'd undoubtedly heard. "Mrs. Henderson," Caleb said politely, tipping his hat, "Miss Whitmore will need the afternoon to rest. I trust she won't be disturbed?" "Of course, Mr. Rourke, of course." Mrs. Henderson bobbed her head rapidly. She wouldn't dare cross Caleb Rourke, not when half her store's supplies came through his ranch connections. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, aware of Caleb following a respectful distance behind. When she reached her door, she turned to face him in the narrow hallway. "Why?" she asked simply. Caleb removed his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with early gray. "May I come in? We should talk privately." It was improper, catastrophically so, for an unmarried woman to allow a man into her private quarters. But after the day she'd had, propriety seemed like a joke Eleanor was tired of hearing. She opened the door. Her room was small but neat. A narrow bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand with a chipped basin, a small desk where she prepared lessons, a trunk containing her few possessions, and a single window overlooking the alley behind the store. It wasn't much, but it had been hers. Caleb stood in the middle of the small space, his hat in his hands, suddenly seeming too large for the cramped quarters. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, the only real place to sit, and looked up at him, waiting. "You want to know why I did that?" he said. "Obviously." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "You reminded me of someone," he finally said. "My sister, Abigail. She was about your age when something similar happened to her." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. "What happened?" "A rumor started in our town back in Missouri. Someone claimed they'd seen her with a man, claimed she was pregnant. It wasn't true. She was innocent. But the town didn't care about the truth." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Eleanor could hear the grief beneath it like bedrock under thin soil. "No one defended her. Our father was dead, our mother too sick to fight. I was only 17, working at a ranch 3 counties away. By the time I got word and made it home, Abigail had—" He stopped, swallowed hard. She'd ended her own life. Couldn't bear the shame of an accusation she couldn't disprove. Eleanor's hand went to her throat. "Mr. Rourke, I'm so sorry." "I swore then," he continued, his gray eyes meeting hers, "that if I ever saw another woman being destroyed by lies, I'd do what no one did for my sister. I'd stand up and be counted." "But you're claiming a child that doesn't exist," Eleanor said softly. "You're tying yourself to me, a stranger, based on a lie." "I'm untying you from a different lie," he corrected. "One that would have destroyed you. This way, you keep your reputation, your position, your life, and I—" He shrugged. "I need a wife anyway. The ranch is doing well, but it's lonely, and I'm not getting any younger. So this is a business arrangement." Eleanor tried to keep the disappointment from her voice, though she wasn't sure why she felt disappointed. What else would it be? "Yes, a business arrangement." But something flickered in Caleb's eyes as he said it, something Eleanor couldn't quite read. "I'll provide for you, protect you, give you the Rourke name and all that comes with it. In return, you'll run the household, help with the ranch accounts. I hear you're good with figures. And we'll present a proper marriage to the town. No one needs to know it's anything other than what it appears." "And when there's no baby?" Eleanor asked. "What do we tell people then?" "We'll say you lost it. Happens all the time early on. Tragic, but not scandalous. After a few months of marriage, the gossip will die down. You'll be Mrs. Caleb Rourke, and Constance Bradley will have to find someone else to torment." It was logical, practical, and completely insane. "Mr. Rourke, Caleb, I can't ask you to sacrifice yourself for me." "You're not asking, I'm offering." He put his hat back on, adjusting it carefully. "The question is whether you're brave enough to accept. Because I won't lie to you, Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor?" She nodded. "This won't be easy. Marriage never is, even when it's for love. And ours will start with the whole town watching, waiting for us to fail, waiting for proof that you really were carrying someone else's child. We'll have to be convincing. We'll have to appear devoted. Can you do that?" Eleanor thought of her alternative, leaving Red Hollow in disgrace, finding another town where her reputation hadn't preceded her, starting over with nothing and no one. Or staying and fighting a rumor that had already been believed by everyone who mattered, slowly watching her life disintegrate under the weight of whispered speculation. Or she could accept this impossible offer from this complicated man and see where it led. "I can do that," she said. Caleb nodded, satisfied. "Then we'll tell Reverend Walsh to prepare for a wedding this Sunday. I'll speak to the school board tomorrow and make sure your position is restored, and I'll start having my things moved from the ranch house into the guest room." "The guest room?" "I told you, this is a business arrangement. You'll have the main bedroom. I'll sleep separately." "I won't—" He cleared his throat, suddenly awkward in a way he hadn't been before. "I won't expect anything beyond what we've agreed to. Companionship, partnership, respect. That's all." Eleanor should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something strange twist in her chest. "That's very honorable of you." I'm not sure honor has much to do with it," Caleb said dryly. "It's just the right thing to do." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Eleanor, you should know. There will be talk. People will say you trapped me, that I'm a fool, that this is some elaborate scheme. They'll say worse things too. Can you bear that?" Eleanor thought of the last few hours, of standing alone while the entire town condemned her, of watching her life fall apart, based on nothing more than Constance Bradley's malicious imagination. "I can bear anything," she said quietly, "as long as I'm not alone." Something changed in Caleb's expression, a softening around his eyes. "You won't be alone. Not anymore." After he left, Eleanor sat in her small room as the afternoon light faded to evening. She should have been terrified. She should have been questioning her decision to tie herself to a stranger, but instead she felt an odd sense of calm, like the stillness after a storm. She walked to the window and looked out over Red Hollow. Somewhere out there, Constance Bradley was probably already spinning new stories, finding new angles of attack. The other women would be dissecting every detail of Eleanor's engagement, comparing notes, building elaborate theories. The men would be clapping Caleb on the back, congratulating him on his conquest, making crude jokes about what he'd been getting in advance of the wedding. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She'd survive today's ordeal. She'd survive whatever came next, because she wouldn't be alone. She'd have Caleb Rourke beside her, and something in his eyes when he'd spoken of his sister told Eleanor that this man, whatever his flaws, understood loyalty and protection in a way that most people never would. 3 days later, Eleanor stood in the small room behind Red Hollow's church, looking at herself in a borrowed mirror. The dress was borrowed too, cream-colored silk with pearl buttons, lent by Sarah Pritchard, who was near enough to Eleanor's size that the fit was almost perfect. Someone had woven late-season wildflowers into Eleanor's hair. She looked, she thought, with dark humor, like a real bride, like a woman who is marrying for love rather than survival. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. It was now 1:30, and Eleanor could hear the church filling with townspeople, all eager to witness this unexpected union. Everyone would attend, partly out of genuine interest, partly to judge whether Caleb Rourke was making a terrible mistake, and partly in hopes of spotting any sign that the bride was indeed expecting. A knock at the door made Eleanor turn. "Come in?" To her surprise, it was Caleb who entered, closing the door behind him. He was dressed in a black suit that fit him perfectly, his hair freshly cut, his jaw freshly shaved. He looked, Eleanor thought with a skip of her pulse, devastatingly handsome. "The groom isn't supposed to see the bride before the ceremony," Eleanor said, trying for lightness. "I think we can agree that traditional rules don't quite apply to us," Caleb replied. He pulled something from his pocket. "I brought you this. It was my mother's." He opened his palm to reveal a ring, a simple gold band with a small sapphire set in delicate scrollwork. It was beautiful and obviously old, worn smooth by years of wear. "Caleb, I can't take your mother's ring. She'd want you to have it," he said firmly. "And more practically, the town will expect you to wear a proper wedding band. This will serve." He took her left hand, and Eleanor felt a shock at the contact, at the warmth of his calloused fingers against hers. Slowly, he slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It fit perfectly. "There," he said softly, still holding her hand. "Now you look like a bride." Eleanor stared at the ring, feeling the weight of it, the significance. This wasn't just a prop for their performance. This was Caleb's mother's ring, a piece of his history, his family. He was giving it to her, a virtual stranger. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, looking up at him. "It's not too late to change your mind. I could leave town tonight. You could tell everyone I ran off that I was exactly what Constance said. You'd be free." "I don't want to be free," Caleb said. "I want to do this. Do you?" Eleanor thought about the question. Did she want to marry this man? 48 hours ago, she couldn't have imagined such a scenario, but standing here now, looking into Caleb Rourke's steady gray eyes, feeling the solid warmth of his hand still holding hers, she found her answer. "Yes," she said, "I do." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Good, because Reverend Walsh is getting anxious, and I think half the town is pressed up against the church windows trying to see if you're showing yet." Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. "God, they're all horrible." "Completely horrible," Caleb agreed. "But there are horrible townspeople now. We're in this together, Eleanor. Partners." He offered his arm, and Eleanor took it. Together, they walked from the small room into the church proper. The sanctuary was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. Eleanor saw Constance Bradley in the third row, her expression sour. She saw the school board members, the Hendersons, families whose children she'd taught. She saw judgment and curiosity and scandal hunger on dozens of faces. But she also saw, to her surprise, a few genuinely kind expressions. Mrs. Keller from the bakery, who'd always brought extra rolls for the school children. Tom Martinez, who'd built new shelves for her classroom. Even young Sarah Morton, one of her best students, was beaming at her with the romantic enthusiasm of a 15-year-old girl. Caleb walked her down the aisle, and Eleanor realized that was unusual too. Typically, the bride's father walked her to meet the groom. But she had no father here, no family at all. So Caleb walked with her, claiming her before the town, making clear that she was under his protection. Reverend Walsh stood at the altar, beaming as though he'd arranged this match himself, rather than tried to fire Eleanor 3 days earlier. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today." Eleanor barely heard the words. She was too aware of Caleb beside her, tall and solid, too aware of his hand holding hers, too aware of the enormity of what they were doing. "Do you, Caleb Michael Rourke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Caleb said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "And do you, Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Eleanor looked at Caleb, at this man who'd saved her for reasons she still didn't fully understand. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Walsh smiled broadly. "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." For a moment, neither of them moved. This hadn't been discussed. A business arrangement, Caleb had said. Separate rooms, companionship, respect. But now, in front of the entire town, they were expected to seal their vows with a kiss. Caleb leaned down slowly, giving Eleanor time to pull away if she chose. She didn't pull away. His lips touched hers, gentle and brief, a kiss that managed to be both chaste and somehow achingly intimate. When he pulled back, Eleanor's heart was racing. The church erupted in applause, and Eleanor realized with a start that their performance had been convincing. They looked, she supposed, like a couple in love, like a hasty wedding born of passion rather than scandal containment. As they walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife now, no longer Eleanor Whitmore but Eleanor Rourke, Eleanor saw Constance Bradley's expression and felt a surge of satisfaction. The old woman looked like she'd been cheated of her prize, a predator denied its kill. Outside the church, people crowded around to offer congratulations, to examine Eleanor's ring, to slap Caleb on the back and make knowing comments about his apparent urgency to wed. Caleb handled it all with easy grace, his hand warm and steady at the small of Eleanor's back. "Congratulations, Mrs. Rourke," Harold Pritchard said, shaking Eleanor's hand. "And about your teaching position, the board met yesterday and we'd be very pleased if you'd return to the schoolhouse. After a brief honeymoon, of course." Eleanor blinked. "You're offering me my job back?" "Well, naturally. Now that you're a respectable married woman, there's no reason you can't continue your excellent work. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to focus on your new duties as Mrs. Caleb Rourke." He looked between them hopefully, clearly wondering if Eleanor would step aside and leave the position open for someone else. "I'll be returning," Eleanor said firmly. She felt Caleb's hand press against her back, a silent message of support. "I love teaching. I have no intention of abandoning my students." "Wonderful, wonderful!" Pritchard looked less than thrilled, but what could he say? He'd made the offer, and Eleanor had accepted. The reception was held in the church hall, an impromptu affair thrown together by the ladies of the congregation, who couldn't resist the opportunity for a social gathering. There was cake and punch, and someone had brought a fiddle, and before Eleanor knew what was happening, she was dancing with her new husband while the whole town watched. "You're very good at this," Eleanor murmured, as Caleb led her through a waltz. "At dancing." "At pretending. At making them believe this is real." Caleb's hand tightened on her waist, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "Who says I'm pretending?" Eleanor's breath caught, but before she could respond, the dance ended and someone else was claiming Caleb's attention, a rancher wanting to discuss cattle prices. Eleanor found herself surrounded by women, all chattering and laughing and examining her ring. As the afternoon wore into evening, Eleanor kept catching glimpses of Caleb across the room. Each time, she found him already looking at her, something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Not obligation, not pity, something else entirely. Finally, as the sun began to set, Caleb appeared at her elbow. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Rourke?" Home. The word sent a shiver through her. Not her small room above the general store, but Caleb's ranch house 10 miles outside of town, a place she'd never seen. Her new life. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'm ready." They said their goodbyes amid a flurry of well wishes and barely concealed speculation. A wagon waited outside, driven by one of Caleb's ranch hands, a young man named Tom, who tipped his hat politely and didn't ask any awkward questions. Eleanor's trunk had already been loaded, containing everything she owned in the world. It looked pitifully small in the back of the wagon. She climbed up onto the bench seat, and Caleb settled beside her, taking the reins from Tom. As they pulled away from the church, away from Red Hollow, Eleanor looked back at the town. The last of the sunlight caught the church steeple, turning it gold. People were already dispersing, heading home to their own lives, undoubtedly ready to discuss every detail of Eleanor and Caleb's wedding. "Any regrets?" Caleb asked quietly. Eleanor turned to face forward, to face the road ahead, the unknown. "Ask me again in a year," Caleb smiled. "Fair enough." They rode in comfortable silence, the wagon creaking, the horses' hooves steady on the packed dirt road. The landscape opened up around them, rolling hills covered in grass that was just starting to turn autumn gold, the mountains rising in the distance, purple and blue against the darkening sky. It was beautiful in a way that the streets of Boston had never been, wild and open and free. After about an hour, Caleb pointed ahead. "There, that's home." Eleanor looked and saw a house in the distance, built of stone and wood, larger than she'd expected. There was a barn beside it, and several other outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved like shadows in the gathering dusk. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see that the house was well maintained, with a covered porch and actual glass windows, expensive out here, and smoke rising from the chimney. Someone had been here before them, preparing the house. A lamp glowed welcomingly in one window. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and his hands lingered at her waist for just a moment before he released her. He grabbed her trunk as though it weighed nothing and led her up the porch steps. The front door opened into a large main room with a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and bookshelves that lined one wall. Beyond it, Eleanor could see a kitchen and a hallway that presumably led to the bedrooms. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said honestly. The house was simple but well built, the home of a man who'd worked hard for what he had, and maintained it with pride. "I'll show you to your room," Caleb said. He led her down the hallway and opened a door to reveal a spacious bedroom with a large bed covered in a wedding ring quilt, a wardrobe, a washstand with a real porcelain basin, and another window looking out over the ranch. He set her trunk at the foot of the bed. "The guest room, my room, is down the hall, but Eleanor—" He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "If you ever change your mind about the sleeping arrangements, just say so. I meant what I said about this being a business arrangement, but I want you to know that I would be honored if it became something more." Eleanor stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "Caleb, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Just know that the offer stands. Good night, Eleanor. Welcome home." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her bed, in her room, in the house she now shared with the man who was her husband, but also still a stranger. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight, the sapphire glowing deep blue. She thought about everything that had happened in the last 3 days. The accusation, the suspension, the public humiliation. And then Caleb, stepping out of the crowd with those 5 words that had changed everything. "If she carries, it's mine." He'd saved her, but he'd also bound them together in ways neither of them could fully predict. This marriage was supposed to be a solution, a shield against scandal. But Eleanor suspected, as she sat alone in her new bedroom listening to the strange sounds of the ranch at night, that it was going to be much more complicated than that. Because when Caleb had kissed her in the church, brief as it was, Eleanor had felt something. And when he'd said he'd be honored if their arrangement became something more, she'd felt that same something intensify. She didn't love Caleb Rourke. How could she? They barely knew each other. But she was beginning to think that maybe, possibly, with time and patience and the strange circumstances that had brought them together, she could learn to love him. And that possibility, Eleanor realized as she changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, was both terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Outside her window, the Colorado night stretched vast and dark, full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar sounds, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of the windmill turning in the morning breeze, footsteps on the porch below her window. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the sapphire ring caught the early light streaming through the curtains, and memory flooded back. She was married. This was her home now. And somewhere in this house was the man who'd claimed her as his wife to save her from ruin. She dressed quickly in a simple brown calico dress, braided her hair, and ventured out of her bedroom. The hallway was empty, but she could smell coffee and something else, bacon maybe, and fresh bread. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd barely eaten at yesterday's reception, too nervous and overwhelmed to do more than pick at the cake. The kitchen was larger than she'd realized in last night's dim lamplight. There was a proper cast-iron stove, a deep sink with an actual pump handle, shelves lined with dishes and supplies, and a solid wooden table with 4 chairs. Standing at the stove, his back to her, was Caleb. He'd rolled up his shirt sleeves, and Eleanor found herself momentarily distracted by the corded muscles of his forearms as he flipped something in a skillet. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Caleb turned, and his face broke into a smile that did strange things to Eleanor's pulse. "Morning. I hope you slept well." "Very well, actually." It was true. Despite everything, despite the strangeness of the situation, Eleanor had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. "Good. Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." Caleb gestured to the table with his spatula. Eleanor sat, feeling oddly awkward. "You cook?" "Well, I've been living alone for the better part of 10 years. It was either learn to cook or starve." He slid eggs and bacon onto 2 plates, added thick slices of bread, and brought them to the table. "I'm not fancy, but I'm competent. Coffee?" "Please." He poured 2 cups and settled into the chair across from her. For a moment they ate in silence. The food was good, simple but well prepared. Eleanor tried not to think about how domestic this felt, how strangely normal, as though they were any married couple sharing breakfast rather than 2 people engaged in an elaborate deception. "I thought I'd show you around the ranch today," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Introduce you to the hands, give you a sense of how things work here. That is, if you're interested." "Of course I'm interested. This is my home now." Eleanor paused, then added carefully, "Though I should probably understand what my role is here. You said this was a business arrangement. What exactly does that mean in practical terms?" Caleb set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. "It means whatever we want it to mean, I suppose. Most ranch wives handle the household, cooking, cleaning, managing supplies. They often help with the accounts, with correspondence, sometimes with the business side of things. But Eleanor, I don't expect you to become someone you're not. You're a teacher. You have your own work. I can hire someone to help with the household tasks if you'd rather focus on your students." "I can manage a household and teach," Eleanor said, feeling a spark of her old pride. "I'm perfectly capable of doing both." "I didn't mean to suggest you weren't capable," Caleb's voice was gentle. "I just meant you don't have to prove anything to me. You've already proven plenty by agreeing to this arrangement." Eleanor looked down at her plate. "I haven't thanked you properly for what you did. You saved me, Caleb. You gave me back my life when Constance Bradley was determined to destroy it. You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." Eleanor raised her eyes to meet his. "What you did was extraordinary. You risked your own reputation, tied yourself to a scandal, claimed responsibility for something that never happened. Most men would never do that for a stranger." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. "You're not a stranger, Eleanor." We've spoken perhaps a dozen words to each other before last week. I know. Caleb stood abruptly, collecting their empty plates. But I've watched you for 4 years. I've seen how you are with your students, how patient and kind. I've seen you stand up to Harold Pritchard when he tried to cut the school budget. I've seen you walking to church every Sunday, rain or shine. I've seen you laughing with the children, sitting alone reading by the river, teaching that Mexican boy to read English when half the town thought he didn't deserve an education. He set the plates in the sink with more force than necessary. So no, we haven't had lengthy conversations. But I know who you are, Eleanor, and I knew exactly what kind of woman Constance Bradley was trying to destroy. Eleanor sat frozen, absorbing this revelation. Caleb had been watching her. For 4 years, he'd been noticing her, observing her life, forming opinions about her character. The thought should have been unsettling. Instead, it sent a strange warmth through her chest. I didn't know you noticed, she said quietly. Caleb turned, leaning back against the counter. I'm a rancher, Eleanor. Observation is half my job. Watching the weather, watching the cattle, watching for problems before they become disasters. I notice things. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. And you are always worth noticing. Before Eleanor could respond to that loaded statement, there was a knock at the door. Caleb's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. That'll be my foreman. Come on, I'll introduce you. The man standing on the porch was perhaps 40 years old, weathered and lean, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Morning, boss, ma'am. He touched his hat respectfully to Eleanor. Eleanor, this is James Patterson. He's been my foreman for 8 years, and he runs this place better than I do. James, my wife, Eleanor Rourke. Eleanor saw James's eyes widen slightly at the word wife, but he recovered quickly. Pleasure to meet you properly, Mrs. Rourke. Congratulations on your marriage. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Just James, ma'am. Mr. Patterson makes me sound like my father, and he was considerably more respectable than I'll ever be. His grin was infectious. Over the next hour, Caleb walked Eleanor around the ranch. He introduced her to the other hands, 6 men who worked the land, tended the cattle, maintained the buildings. There was young Tom, who'd driven the wagon yesterday. Miguel, the Mexican man who managed the horses with an almost supernatural skill. Old Charlie, who'd been a cowboy for 40 years and had stories that could make you laugh or cry depending on his mood. The others were Kevin, Hank, and a boy of about 16 named Billy, who blushed scarlet when Eleanor spoke to him. They were respectful, these men, but Eleanor could see the questions in their eyes. They knew about the scandal, they'd heard the rumors, and they were wondering, just as the rest of Red Hollow wondered, whether their boss had been trapped by a scheming woman or had genuinely fallen for the schoolteacher hard enough to marry her within a week of claiming her child. Don't mind them, Caleb said quietly as they walked toward the barn. They're good men. They'll come around. They're loyal to you, Eleanor observed. They're worried I'll hurt you. Maybe, but they'll see soon enough that you're not the kind of woman who hurts people. Caleb opened the barn door, and the smell of hay and horses washed over them. Besides, what matters is what we know, not what they think. The barn was impressive, clean, well-organized, with stalls for a dozen horses. Caleb showed her his favorite mount, a big black gelding named Midnight, who nuzzled his hand looking for treats. Eleanor found herself relaxing as they moved through the barn, Caleb pointing out different horses, explaining his breeding program, his plans for expanding the herd. You really love this, Eleanor said. The ranch, the work. It's not just business for you. No, it's not just business. Caleb stroked Midnight's nose absently. When I came out here 10 years ago, I had $50 in a saddle. Everything I've built from nothing. This ranch represents every hour I've worked, every risk I've taken, every decision I've made. It's my legacy, I suppose. The thing I'll leave behind. For your children, Eleanor said without thinking, then immediately wished she could take it back. But Caleb just nodded slowly. Maybe. Someday. He looked at her sidelong. That's part of why I said I needed a wife anyway. A ranch this size needs family to pass it on to. Otherwise, it's just land and cattle with no real purpose. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. Children. They hadn't discussed children. Their arrangement was supposed to be a business partnership, separate rooms, no expectations beyond public appearances. But children would Well, obviously, they would require a very different kind of marriage than the one they'd agreed to. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb added quickly, "But there's no pressure, Eleanor. I'm not expecting anything. I just meant, if we ever decided to make this a real marriage, in all ways, then children would be a natural hope. But it's entirely up to you." "We should probably discuss expectations more clearly," Eleanor said, uncomfortable but determined to be practical. "If we're going to make this work, we need to be honest with each other about what we want." "Fair enough." Caleb closed the stall door and leaned against it, giving Eleanor his full attention. "What do you want, Eleanor? Not what you think you should want, not what's proper or expected. What do you actually want?" It was such a direct question that Eleanor found herself answering with equal directness. "I want my dignity back. I want to teach without people whispering about me. I want to be able to walk down Main Street with my head up. I want—" She paused, considering. "I want the freedom to be myself without constantly fearing that I'll step outside some invisible boundary and be condemned for it." "That's a start," Caleb said. "What else?" "I want partnership, respect, intellectual companionship. I've been alone most of my life, even when I was surrounded by people. I don't want to be alone anymore." Eleanor met his eyes. "What about you? What do you want from this marriage?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I want what you want. Partnership, respect, companionship. I want someone to talk to at the end of a long day. I want someone who'll challenge me when I'm being stubborn and support me when I'm right. I want—" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "I want a real marriage, Eleanor. Not just a performance for the town, but I'm willing to wait for that, for however long it takes, because I'd rather have you as a friend and partner than not have you at all." Eleanor's heart was beating fast. This was more honesty than she'd expected, more vulnerability than she'd anticipated from this reserved, self-contained man. "And if I never want more than friendship? If separate rooms is all I can offer? Then that's what we'll have," Caleb said simply. "I meant what I said yesterday. I won't expect anything beyond what you're willing to give." They stood there in the barn, dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through the high windows, horses shifting in their stalls. Eleanor felt as though they were standing on the edge of something important, some decision that would shape the rest of their lives. "I can't make you any promises," she said finally, "about feelings, about the future. But I can promise to try. To be a real partner in this marriage, to make it work as well as we can. Is that enough?" "It's more than enough," Caleb said. "It's everything." The moment was broken by James's voice calling from outside. "Boss, got a situation with the fence line in the north pasture. Looks like we've got some cattle wandering where they shouldn't be." Caleb sighed. "Duty calls. Will you be all right here for a few hours? There's food in the kitchen, books in the main room if you want to read." "I'll be fine," Eleanor assured him. "I thought I might start familiarizing myself with the household. Maybe make some bread for dinner, if that's all right." "Eleanor, this is your home. You don't need my permission for anything." Caleb smiled, touching his hat in farewell. "I'll be back by late afternoon." Eleanor watched him stride out of the barn, calling instructions to James. Then she made her way back to the house, taking her time, observing everything with the teacher's careful eye. The house was clean, but clearly lacked a woman's touch. There were no curtains on some windows, no rugs on the floors, no personal touches that made a house feel like a home. But the bones were good. With some work, some care, this could be a warm, welcoming place. She spent the morning exploring, taking inventory of the kitchen supplies, discovering a root cellar stocked with vegetables and preserves. Someone, probably one of the ranch hand's wives from a neighboring property, had left fresh milk and butter in the cool box. Eleanor found flour and yeast and set about making bread, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of kneading dough. As the bread rose, she ventured into the main room and examined the bookshelves. To her surprise, the collection was extensive and varied. There were practical volumes on ranching and animal husbandry, but also poetry, philosophy, several novels by Dickens and Hawthorne, and a worn copy of Shakespeare's complete works. These were not the books of an uneducated cowboy. These were the books of a man who valued learning, who read for pleasure and improvement. Eleanor pulled down the Shakespeare and opened it, finding notes in the margins in what must be Caleb's handwriting. Comments, questions, observations. She traced one with her finger. Is Hamlet's madness real or performed? Like our marriage, performance that might become truth? Her breath caught. The note was recent, the ink not yet faded. Caleb had been thinking about their situation in literary terms, comparing it to Shakespeare's great tragedy. Or perhaps not tragedy. Perhaps he saw their marriage as comedy in the classical sense, disorder that would eventually resolve into harmony. Finding anything interesting? Eleanor jumped, nearly dropping the book. She hadn't heard Caleb return. I thought you'd be gone for hours. False alarm. The cattle had just found a weak spot in the fence, but we patched it quickly. Caleb removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I was just admiring your library. I didn't expect such an extensive collection. My mother was a teacher, Caleb said, moving to stand beside her. Before she married my father, before they came west. She believed education was the greatest gift she could give her children. She made sure Abigail and I could both read before we were 5 years old, and she filled our house with books. His voice softened. After she died, the books were all I had left of her. I've been collecting them ever since. She would be proud of you, Eleanor said impulsively. The man you've become, the success you've achieved. Would she? Caleb's smile was sad. I think she'd be disappointed that I couldn't save Abigail, that I let my sister die because I wasn't there when she needed me. Eleanor set the book down and turned to face him fully. Caleb, you were 17 and working 3 counties away. What happened to your sister wasn't your fault. My head knows that. My heart's been slower to accept it. He looked at Eleanor, and his eyes were haunted. For years, I threw myself into work, into building this ranch. Because if I stopped moving, stopped working, I'd have to think about what I'd lost. But saving you, he stopped, swallowed hard. Standing up for you when no one stood up for Abigail, it felt like maybe I could make something right. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Eleanor said softly. She reached out without thinking and took his hand. You're a good man, Caleb Rourke. Better than you give yourself credit for. His fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment they stood there in the quiet house, hands linked, something unspoken passing between them. Then the smell of baking bread suddenly intensified, and Eleanor gasped. The bread! They rushed to the kitchen together, where the loaves had risen beautifully and were now browning perfectly in the oven. Eleanor used a cloth to pull them out, setting them on the counter to cool. The kitchen filled with the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread. That smells incredible, Caleb said. It's just bread. But Eleanor was pleased by the compliment. It's home, Caleb corrected. That's what it smells like. Home. They had lunch together, cold ham and cheese with Eleanor's fresh bread, and the conversation flowed more easily now. Caleb told her about the ranch's history, about the challenges of raising cattle in Colorado's unpredictable climate, about his plans to expand into horse breeding. Eleanor talked about teaching, about her students, about her hopes of eventually starting a lending library in Red Hollow so more children could access books. We could donate some, Caleb said immediately. From my collection. Whatever would help. You'd give away your mother's books? I'd share them, he corrected. That's what my mother would have wanted. Knowledge shared, not hoarded. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. This man, this complicated, generous man she'd married, kept surprising her. After lunch, Caleb had to ride out again to check on another section of the property. Eleanor spent the afternoon making the house more livable, washing windows, sweeping floors, rearranging furniture to let in more light. It was satisfying work, physical and immediate. By the time the sun began to set, she was tired but content. She prepared dinner, beef stew with vegetables from the root cellar, more of the fresh bread, dried apple pie for dessert. The men came in from the range as darkness fell, and Eleanor found herself feeding not just Caleb but James and Miguel, who'd been working late. The 2 ranch hands were clearly uncomfortable at first, uncertain how to behave around their boss's new wife. But Eleanor had spent years managing classrooms full of uncertain children. She knew how to put people at ease. James, Caleb tells me you've been foreman here for 8 years. You must have seen everything, every drought, every blizzard, every disaster that could befall a ranch. James relaxed slightly. Well, ma'am, I've seen my share, that's for certain. The winter of 72 was particularly brutal. We lost near about a quarter of the herd. The conversation flowed from there, stories traded back and forth, laughter punctuating the tales of mishaps and near disasters. Eleanor watched Caleb interact with his men and saw the respect and genuine affection that flowed both ways. This was a good place, she realized, a place where people worked hard but were treated fairly, where loyalty was earned rather than demanded. After the men left, Eleanor and Caleb cleaned up the dishes together. It was companionable work, a rhythm they fell into naturally. He washed, she dried, they talked about nothing and everything. You were good with them, Caleb said as he drained the wash basin. James and Miguel. They're usually shy around strangers. They're not shy, they're protective of you. Eleanor hung up the drying cloth. They wanted to make sure I was worthy of you. And? I think I passed the initial test. We'll see about the long-term evaluation. Caleb laughed, and Eleanor realized she loved that sound, deep and genuine. You'll do more than pass. Give them a week, and they'll be devoted to you. They moved to the main room, where Caleb had built up the fire against the evening chill. Eleanor settled into one of the comfortable chairs with a book, and Caleb sat at the desk with a ledger, working on the ranch accounts. It was peaceful, domestic, and Eleanor found herself thinking that if this was what marriage could be, companionship, shared work, comfortable silence, then maybe she'd been wrong to avoid it for so long. Eleanor? Caleb's voice broke the quiet. May I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you come west? You said you came from Boston 4 years ago, but you've never mentioned why you left. Eleanor's hand stilled on her book. She'd known this question would come eventually. It's not a very exciting story. I'd still like to hear it, if you're willing to share. Eleanor set the book aside and stared into the fire. I was engaged, she said finally, to a man named Robert Thornton. He was a banker's son, very proper, very respectable. My parents had died the year before, cholera. And I was alone with very little money. Robert seemed like a good match, safe. But 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he was also courting another woman, someone wealthier, better connected. He'd been using me as a placeholder, I suppose, someone to pass the time with while he pursued more advantageous options. Eleanor's voice was matter of fact, but the old hurt still echoed beneath the words. When I confronted him, he told me I should be grateful he'd paid me any attention at all, that I was 22 years old, plain, poor, and had no prospects, that I should thank him for the social elevation our engagement had provided. What did you do? Caleb's voice was quiet but intense. I broke off the engagement, publicly, at a dinner party his parents were hosting. I stood up in front of Boston's finest society and told them exactly why I was ending our arrangement. Eleanor smiled bitterly at the memory. Robert was humiliated, his parents were furious, and I became persona non grata in Boston society. So I took what little money I had, applied for teaching positions out west, and ended up in Red Hollow. You're not playing, Caleb said firmly. Eleanor blinked at him. What? Robert Thornton told you that you were playing. He was wrong. You're beautiful, Eleanor, not in a showy way, but in the way that matters. Intelligence in your eyes, kindness in your smile, strength in the way you carry yourself. That fool didn't deserve you. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Caleb, I'm not saying it to flatter you. I'm saying it because it's true. He stood up from the desk and came to sit in the chair opposite hers. And I'm saying it because I want you to know that whatever lies Robert Thornton told you about your worth, I don't believe any of them. Neither should you. Eleanor found she couldn't look away from his gray eyes, couldn't break the intensity of his gaze. Why are you being so kind to me? Because you deserve kindness, because He stopped, seemed to reconsider. Because we're partners now, and partners tell each other the truth. Then here's a truth for you, Eleanor said, her heart pounding but determined to be as honest as he'd been. I'm terrified of this marriage, not of you, but of hoping, of letting myself believe that this could be real, that we could be real, and then discovering it was all an illusion. I've been hurt before, Caleb. I don't know if I can survive being hurt again. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. I can't promise you'll never be hurt. Life doesn't work that way, but I can promise I'll never deliberately hurt you. I can promise I'll be honest with you, even when honesty is hard. And I can promise that whatever this marriage becomes, I'll respect you and value you every single day. That's a lot to promise, Eleanor whispered. I know, but I mean every word. They sat there in the firelight, two people who'd become husband and wife under the strangest of circumstances, slowly discovering that maybe, just maybe, fate had known what it was doing when it brought them together. The next morning, Eleanor woke determined to return to her teaching. The school board had reinstated her, and she wasn't going to give them or the town any reason to question that decision. She dressed in her most professional outfit, pinned her hair up severely, and prepared herself for battle. Caleb insisted on driving her into town. I have business at the bank anyway, he said, though Eleanor suspected he just wanted to make sure she was all right facing Red Hollow for the first time since the wedding. The schoolhouse looked exactly as she'd left it 5 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed. Eleanor stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of chalk and wood and children. Her classroom. Her sanctuary. She'd barely begun preparing the day's lessons when the first parent arrived. It was Martha Collins, mother of 2 of Eleanor's students. Mrs. Rourke, Martha said, and Eleanor noticed she used the new name with careful emphasis. I wanted to welcome you back and to apologize. Apologize? For believing the worst, for not speaking up when Constance Bradley was spreading her poison. Martha twisted her hands together. You've been nothing but good to my children, and I should have defended you. I'm sorry. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know. Over the course of the morning, 3 more parents came by with similar messages. Not everyone in Red Hollow had believed the lies. Not everyone had condemned her. Some had simply been too afraid of Constance's power to speak up. But now, with Caleb Rourke standing behind her, they found their courage. When the children arrived at 8 o'clock, Eleanor rang the bell and watched them file in, their faces alight with excitement at seeing her again. Young Sarah Morton hugged her impulsively. Billy Jenkins, usually too cool to show emotion, grinned widely. Even the littlest ones, who probably didn't fully understand what had happened, seemed happy she was back. Good morning, students, Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Let's begin. She taught with renewed passion that day, pouring all her fear and relief and determination into her lessons. These children were why she'd come west, why she'd fought to keep her position, why she'd accepted Caleb's impossible proposal. They deserved a good education, and she was going to give it to them. At noon, when the children scattered for lunch, Eleanor sat at her desk and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd survived. No, more than survived. She'd returned stronger, more determined, and with the backing of the most powerful man in the territory. A knock at the door made her look up. Constance Bradley stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Eleanor stood slowly. Mrs. Bradley. Mrs. Rourke. Constance's voice was cold. I thought we should speak. Did you? Eleanor kept her voice level, refusing to be intimidated. Constance stepped into the classroom, and Eleanor noticed she didn't cross the threshold deeply, as though afraid to come too close. I want you to know that I still believe my concerns were valid. A woman in your position, unmarried, living alone, it invited speculation. You invited speculation, Eleanor corrected. You started a lie and spread it deliberately. Why, Mrs. Bradley, what did I ever do to you? For a moment, something flickered in Constance's eyes. Uncertainty? Regret? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I did what I thought was right for this community. You nearly destroyed an innocent woman to satisfy your own need for power and control. That's not righteousness, Mrs. Bradley. That's cruelty dressed up in religious clothing. Constance's face flushed with anger. You may have fooled everyone else with your hasty marriage, but I know the truth. You were pregnant, and Caleb Rourke is either the father or a fool who let himself be trapped by a scheming woman. Time will tell which. Time will tell many things, Eleanor said quietly, including whether you can live with yourself knowing what you tried to do to me. Now please leave my classroom. My students will be returning soon, and I don't want them exposed to your particular brand of Christianity. Constance's eyes narrowed, but she turned and left without another word. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. She'd stood up to her tormentor, but it had taken every ounce of courage she possessed. That evening, when Caleb drove her home, she was already thinking of the ranch as home. Eleanor told him about the confrontation. "She won't let this go," Caleb said, his jaw tight. "Constance never does. She'll watch and wait for any sign that our marriage is false, any evidence to prove her accusations." "Then we'll have to make sure she finds none," Eleanor said. "We'll have to be convincing." Caleb glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "How convincing?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "When's the harvest dance?" 2 weeks. "Why?" "Because everyone in Red Hollow will be there. Everyone will be watching us, looking for cracks in our story. We should go. We should dance together, laugh together, show them we're a real married couple." She paused. "Can you do that? Pretend to be in love with me?" Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the barn. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense in the fading light. "Eleanor, I don't think pretending is going to be the problem." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said slowly, carefully, "that every day I spend with you, every conversation we have, every time you laugh or challenge me or show me who you really are, pretending gets harder. Because what I'm starting to feel for you isn't pretend at all." Eleanor stared at him, her heart racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. They'd agreed to partnership, friendship, a business arrangement. But looking at Caleb now, seeing the honesty and vulnerability in his face, Eleanor realized that maybe she wasn't pretending either. "Caleb," she whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready." "I know." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm just telling you the truth. Because we promised each other honesty, remember?" "I remember." "Then here's another truth. I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor Rourke. Maybe I was already halfway there before I ever claimed you in front of that crowd. Maybe that's why I did it, not just for Abigail's memory, but because I couldn't stand by and watch another woman I cared about be destroyed." His thumb brushed her cheek. "You don't have to say anything. You don't have to feel the same way. I just needed you to know." Eleanor couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only feel the warmth of his hand against her face, the sincerity in his words, the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that this marriage of convenience might become something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. "Take your time," Caleb said softly. "We have all the time in the world." He helped her down from the wagon and carried her school satchel into the house. Eleanor followed, her mind spinning, her heart full of fears and hopes she couldn't quite name. Inside, she busied herself with preparing dinner while Caleb went to check on the horses. The domestic routine was comforting, familiar, a counterpoint to the emotional upheaval of the day. They ate together as had become their custom, talking about small things, the ranch, the students, plans for winter. But beneath the ordinary conversation, Eleanor was acutely aware of Caleb's presence, of the weight of his confession hanging between them. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor finally found her voice. "Caleb, about what you said earlier, you don't have to respond," he said quickly. "I know, but I want to." Eleanor set down her book and turned to face him. "I can't promise you love. Not yet. I've been hurt too badly to trust my own feelings. But I can tell you that being here with you, living this life, it feels right in a way nothing has felt right since I left Boston. And every day I find myself less afraid of the possibility that this could become real." Caleb's expression softened. "That's enough, Eleanor. That's more than enough." "Is it?" "Because you deserve more than someone who's half terrified of her own feelings. I deserve exactly what I have, a brave, brilliant, beautiful woman who agreed to marry a relative stranger to escape scandal, and who's somehow managing to turn that impossible situation into a real partnership." He smiled. "The rest will come. Or it won't. Either way, I'm grateful for what we have right now." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, some fear she'd been carrying since the day Robert Thornton had shattered her trust. Caleb wasn't asking for more than she could give. He was accepting her exactly as she was, hesitations, fears, and all. "The harvest dance," she said. "We'll go. And I won't be pretending, Caleb. Whatever happens between us, whatever we become to each other, it won't be pretend." His smile widened. "Then we'll show Red Hollow what a real marriage looks like." As Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom that night, she paused at the top and looked back. Caleb was still sitting by the fire, his profile illuminated by the flames, and something in her chest gave a hard, insistent thump. Not love, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Maybe the first tentative steps toward something she'd given up hoping for. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, to Caleb's footsteps as he eventually made his way to his own room down the hall. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight streaming through the window, the sapphire glowing softly. His mother's ring, his promise, his hope for their future. Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time, to hope too. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The 2 weeks leading up to the harvest dance passed in a rhythm that felt increasingly natural to Eleanor. She woke each morning to the sound of Caleb moving about downstairs, preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude but learning to appreciate company. They'd fall into easy conversation over coffee, discussing her lesson plans or his ranch concerns, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to these morning talks with an anticipation that both pleased and unnerved her. Her days were consumed by teaching. The children had welcomed her back with an enthusiasm that warmed her heart, and Eleanor threw herself into their education with renewed purpose. She introduced new reading materials, expanded the science curriculum to include practical botany lessons using specimens from the ranch, and even convinced Harold Pritchard to allocate funds for a set of new arithmetic primers. Her classroom became a sanctuary again, a place where her competence and authority were unquestioned. But it was the evenings that revealed how much her life had truly changed. She'd returned to the ranch, always driven by Caleb, who made a point of being in town when school dismissed, and they'd spend the remaining daylight hours in companionable activity. Sometimes Eleanor helped with ranch paperwork, her neat handwriting and quick mind for figures making the tedious bookkeeping considerably easier. Other times she'd simply sit on the porch with a book while Caleb worked with the horses, and they'd exchange occasional comments or observations, comfortable in each other's presence. Dinners became a ritual Eleanor cherished. She'd cook, discovering that she enjoyed the creative challenge of turning simple ingredients into satisfying meals, and Caleb would help clean up afterward. Then they'd settle in the main room, Eleanor reading or preparing lessons while Caleb reviewed ranch business or read from his own extensive library. It was peaceful, domestic, and slowly, Eleanor's guard began to lower. On the Wednesday before the dance, Eleanor was grading papers at the kitchen table when Caleb came in from the barn, his expression troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, setting down her pen. "Nothing serious, just town talk." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "James went into Red Hollow for supplies today. He said Constance Bradley's been making noise again." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of noise?" "She's telling people that our marriage is a sham, that you're not really pregnant, that I was duped or bribed into marrying you, and that the truth will come out soon enough." Caleb's jaw clenched. "She's apparently keeping a calendar, counting the months until you should theoretically give birth." "Of course she is." Eleanor tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. "What does she expect? That I'll suddenly produce a baby on command?" "No, she expects that you won't produce one at all, and that will prove her right." Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. "Which is why we need to handle this carefully. In another month or so, we'll let people know you've lost the baby. It's common enough that no one will question it, and it'll put an end to Constance's counting." "A month," Eleanor repeated. "So we have to maintain this fiction for another month before we can move past it." "Does it feel like fiction?" Caleb asked quietly. "Being married to me?" Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at the ring on her finger that she'd stopped thinking of as a prop and started thinking of as hers. "No," she admitted. "It doesn't feel like fiction anymore." "Good." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Because Saturday night, at the dance, I want everyone to see what I see. A real marriage, real affection, real partnership." "What do you see, Caleb?" He met her eyes, and the intensity there made Eleanor's breath catch. I see a woman who's braver than she knows, who survived scandal and shame and came out stronger, who makes my house feel like home and challenges me to be better than I am. I see my wife, Eleanor, and I'm grateful for her every single day. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. You say things like that and make it very difficult for me to keep my emotional distance. Maybe I don't want you to keep your distance. Caleb stood, still holding her hand, and gently pulled her to her feet. Dance with me. What? Here? Now? Why not? The dance is in 3 days. We should practice. Make sure we know how to move together. His eyes glinted with humor. Besides, there's no music to distract us from figuring out the rhythm. Eleanor laughed despite herself. You're absurd. I'm practical. He placed one hand at her waist, held her other hand in his, and began to move in a simple waltz pattern. Eleanor followed, stumbling slightly at first, then finding the cadence. The kitchen was hardly a ballroom, and they had no music but the sound of their own footsteps and breathing, but something about the moment felt magical anyway. See? Caleb murmured as they turned in the small space. We fit together just fine. Eleanor realized he was right. Their heights matched well, her head coming just to his shoulder. His lead was gentle but confident, easy to follow, and the warmth of his hand at her waist sent pleasant shivers through her that had nothing to do with the autumn chill seeping through the windows. When did you learn to dance? She asked. I wouldn't have thought a rancher would have much use for such skills. My mother insisted. She said a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in any social situation, even if those situations were few and far between on a Missouri dirt farm. His expression grew distant. She'd hum while my father played the fiddle, and Abigail and I would take turns dancing with her. I was terrible at it, kept stepping on her feet. But she was patient. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. You remind me of her sometimes, not in appearance, but in spirit. She had that same quiet strength, that same refusal to be diminished by circumstance. Caleb spun Eleanor gently, then pulled her back. She would have liked you. I wish I could have met her. Me too. They swayed together for another moment before Caleb reluctantly released her. There. Now, when we dance on Saturday, it won't be the first time. We'll look like a couple who's comfortable together. Eleanor touched his arm as he stepped back. Caleb, we are a couple who's comfortable together. That's not pretense. Something flared in his eyes, bright and hopeful. No, it's not, is it? The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Eleanor knew she could step back, retreat to the safety of their arrangement, or she could step forward, acknowledge what was growing between them, and risk her heart again. Before she could decide, they heard hoofbeats approaching, one of the ranch hands returning from checking the herd. The spell broke, and they moved apart naturally. But as Eleanor returned to her papers and Caleb went to see what news the ranch hand brought, she felt the ghost of his hand at her waist, the memory of moving together in perfect synchronization. Saturday arrived with crisp autumn weather, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Eleanor spent the morning teaching a half-day of classes, then rushed home to prepare for the evening. The Harvest Dance was Red Hollow's premier social event of the season, held in the church hall that had been cleared of pews and decorated with dried corn stalks, gourds, and late-blooming wildflowers. Everyone would attend. Everyone would watch. Eleanor stood in her bedroom, staring at the limited options in her wardrobe. She'd brought few nice dresses from Boston, and her teaching salary hadn't allowed for frivolous purchases. The best she had was a dark green wool dress with modest trim, serviceable but hardly festive. A knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. Come in. Caleb entered carrying something wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. I thought you might need this. What is it? Open it and see. Eleanor untied the string with trembling fingers and folded back the paper. Inside was a dress of deep sapphire blue silk with delicate cream-colored lace at the collar and cuffs. It was the most beautiful garment Eleanor had ever seen, let alone owned. Caleb, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's not too much. It's exactly right. He moved closer, his expression serious. Eleanor, I'm not trying to buy your affection, but you're my wife, And I want to see you dressed in something that reflects how I see you. Beautiful, worthy of beauty. Eleanor's eyes stung with tears. How did you even know my size? I may have asked Mrs. Henderson for help. She was very enthusiastic about the project, said it was about time someone spoiled the school teacher properly. Caleb smiled. Try it on. If it doesn't fit, we'll have time to adjust it. He left her alone to change, and Eleanor carefully removed her everyday dress and slipped into the blue silk. It fit perfectly, hugging her figure in ways that were flattering but not immodest. The color brought out the blue in her eyes and made her skin glow. She looked, Eleanor thought with wonder, like someone worth noticing, like someone worth cherishing. She descended the stairs to find Caleb waiting in the main room, dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean build. When he turned and saw her, his expression transformed. Eleanor, he breathed, you're stunning. It's the dress. It's you. He crossed to her and took both her hands. The dress just helps everyone else see what I've known all along. They drove into town as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The church hall was already full of people when they arrived, music and laughter spilling out into the street. Eleanor felt her nerves kick in as Caleb helped her down from the wagon, but his steady presence at her side bolstered her courage. Ready? He asked quietly. Ready. They entered together, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the moment the room noticed them. Conversations paused, heads turned, eyes assessed. She felt the weight of judgment, speculation, and curiosity pressing down on her. Then Caleb's hand found the small of her back, warm and reassuring, and he guided her into the room with the confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to be proud of. Caleb! Mrs. Rourke! Reverend Walsh bustled over, his round face beaming. How wonderful to see you both. Mrs. Rourke, you look absolutely radiant. Thank you, Reverend. Eleanor managed a smile. Others approached after that. Harold Pritchard and his wife, James Patterson with his family, several parents of Eleanor's students. The greetings were warm, genuine, and Eleanor began to relax. Not everyone was an enemy. Not everyone believed Constance Bradley's poison. Speaking of whom, Eleanor spotted the older woman across the room, standing with a cluster of similarly disapproving ladies. Constance's eyes were fixed on Eleanor with an expression that promised continued warfare. Ignore her, Caleb murmured in Eleanor's ear. She's not worth your attention. She won't stop, will she? Not until she's proven right, or destroyed trying. Let her try. She can't touch us, Eleanor. Not anymore. The music started up, a lively fiddle tune played by Tom Martinez and two other musicians. Couples moved on to the makeshift dance floor, and Caleb offered Eleanor his hand. Shall we show them how it's done, Mrs. Rourke? Eleanor placed her hand in his. Let's. They moved onto the floor together, and suddenly everything else fell away. The watching eyes, the whispered speculation, Constance's malice, none of it mattered. There was only the music, the movement, and Caleb's steady lead guiding her through the steps. They'd practiced in the kitchen, but this was different. This was public declaration, a statement to everyone watching that they were together, unified, real. Caleb spun her with practiced ease, and Eleanor laughed with the pure joy of movement. When he pulled her back, his eyes were warm with affection and something deeper, something that made Eleanor's heart skip. You're a wonderful dancer, she said breathlessly. I have excellent inspiration. His hand tightened at her waist. You're glowing, Eleanor. You look happy. I am happy. That surprises me as much as anyone. Why should it surprise you? You're safe, respected, free to teach and live as you choose. You have a home, a husband who adores you. He said the last part lightly, but Eleanor heard the truth beneath the teasing tone. Caleb, I know you're not ready to hear it, but it's still true. The music shifted to a slower tune, and Caleb pulled Eleanor closer, proper distance giving way to something more intimate. Eleanor could feel the solid warmth of him, could smell the scent of soap and leather, and something uniquely Caleb. Her head fit perfectly against his shoulder, and she allowed herself to lean into him, to absorb his strength. Everyone's watching us, she whispered. Let them watch. Let them see a man holding his wife. There's nothing scandalous about that. Constance thinks there is. Constance thinks breathing is scandalous if she's not the one doing it. Caleb's voice held dry humor. Stop worrying about her. Focus on this. On us. So Eleanor did. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, let herself be held by this man who'd saved her and then, somehow, begun to heal her. The fear and suspicion she'd carried since Boston were still there, but they were quieter now, drowned out by something warmer, more hopeful. When the song ended, they were both breathing a little harder. Caleb looked down at her with an expression that made Eleanor's pulse race. Punch? He suggested, his voice slightly rough. Please. They made their way to the refreshment table, where several of Eleanor's students' mothers greeted her enthusiastically. Martha Collins pulled Eleanor aside while Caleb fetched drinks. Mrs. Rourke, I have to tell you, my daughters cannot stop talking about you. They say you're the best teacher Red Hollow has ever had. And seeing you here tonight, so happy with Mr. Rourke, it does my heart good. You deserve happiness after what Constance tried to do to you. Thank you, Martha. That means a great deal. We all know the truth now, you know, that you were innocent, that the baby... She lowered her voice. That Mr. Rourke was just being discreet about your courtship. It's actually quite romantic when you think about it. Eleanor managed not to flinch at the irony. The town had created a new narrative, one that absolved them of guilt for believing the original lie. Now the story was that she and Caleb had been secretly courting, that the pregnancy rumor had forced them to acknowledge their relationship prematurely. It wasn't true, but it was more comfortable than admitting they'd all been manipulated by Constance Bradley's malice. Quite romantic, Eleanor agreed, because what else could she say? Caleb returned with punch, and they found seats along the wall to watch the dancing. Several people stopped by to chat, to congratulate them again on their marriage, to comment on what a handsome couple they made. Eleanor fielded questions about teaching and the ranch, while Caleb discussed cattle prices and weather predictions with the men. It felt normal, natural, like any married couple at a social gathering. Then Constance Bradley approached, her expression glacial. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke. Her voice dripped false courtesy. Enjoying the festivities? Very much, Caleb said evenly. It's a lovely evening. Indeed. Though I must say, Mrs. Rourke, you're looking remarkably slender for a woman in your supposed condition. Her eyes raked over Eleanor's figure with undisguised suspicion. One might almost think there was no pregnancy at all. The nearby conversations quieted. People turned to watch, sensing confrontation. Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her, but she placed a hand on his arm, a silent message that she would handle this. She stood, facing Constance with calm dignity. Mrs. Bradley, I'm curious. What exactly would satisfy you? What proof would you require to accept that my marriage to Caleb is legitimate? Constance blinked, clearly not expecting the direct approach. Well, the truth would be a start. The truth is that I married Caleb Rourke because he's a good man who saw a woman being destroyed by lies and chose to protect her. The truth is that whatever existed or didn't exist before our marriage is no one's business but ours. And the truth is that your obsession with my personal life says far more about your character than mine. Eleanor kept her voice level but firm. You tried to ruin me, Mrs. Bradley. You failed. I suggest you accept that and move on with your life, because I've certainly moved on with mine. Constance's face flushed purple. How dare you speak to me that way? I am a pillar of this community. You're a bully, Eleanor interrupted quietly. A bully who uses religion and respectability as weapons to control people you see as threats. But I'm not a threat to you, Mrs. Bradley. I never was. I'm just a woman trying to live her life with dignity, something you seem determined to deny me. Eleanor. Caleb stood, placing himself slightly in front of her. His voice was cold, harder than Eleanor had ever heard it. That's enough. Mrs. Bradley, you will leave my wife alone. You will stop spreading rumors about our marriage. And if I hear that you've said one more word against Eleanor's character, I will ensure that every business owner in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you are. I have that power, and I'm not afraid to use it. The room had gone completely silent. Constance looked from Caleb to Eleanor, her expression shifting from outrage to calculation to something that might have been fear. She was beaten, and she knew it. A woman alone couldn't stand against Caleb Rourke's influence and resources. This isn't over, she said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Caleb said flatly. It's over because I say it's over. Now I suggest you spend less time obsessing about my marriage and more time examining why you feel the need to destroy other women's happiness. Constance turned and stalked away, her supporters scattering before her like leaves before a storm. The music, which had stopped during the confrontation, started up again tentatively. Conversations resumed, though Eleanor could feel the whispers swirling around them. Are you all right? Caleb asked, turning to Eleanor with concern clear on his face. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Eleanor found herself smiling. That felt good, standing up to her, refusing to be intimidated. I should have done it weeks ago. You did it when you were ready. That's what matters. Caleb took her hand. Come on, let's dance again. Show everyone that Constance Bradley and her poison can't touch us. They returned to the floor, and this time there was an edge of defiance in their movement, a statement to everyone watching. We're together. We're strong. You can't break us. Other couples joined them, and soon the floor was full again, the earlier tension dissolving into the joy of the celebration. When they finally left, near midnight, Eleanor was exhausted but triumphant. They drove home under a brilliant canopy of stars, the wagon creaking companionably beneath them. Thank you, Eleanor said into the comfortable silence, for defending me, for standing up to Constance. You defended yourself first, Caleb pointed out. I just reinforced the message. You were magnificent, Eleanor. Brave and strong and absolutely magnificent. I was terrified. Bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear. And you did that tonight. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm around hers. I'm proud to be your husband. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. Caleb, I need to tell you something. All right? When you claimed me in front of the town, when you offered me this marriage, I thought I understood what I was agreeing to. A business arrangement. Protection in exchange for companionship. But it's become so much more than that. She took a deep breath. I don't know if what I'm feeling is love. I don't trust myself enough yet to name it that. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel safe. When I talk to you, I feel heard. When you look at me the way you're looking at me right now, I feel like maybe, just maybe, I could be brave enough to risk my heart again. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road, miles from town, miles from the ranch. He turned to face her fully, his expression intense in the starlight. Eleanor, I don't need you to name what you're feeling. I don't need declarations or promises. I just need you to know that whatever you're willing to give, I'll treasure it. If all you can offer is companionship and respect, that's enough. If someday you can offer more, I'll be the luckiest man alive. But there's no pressure, no expectation. Just two people figuring out how to build a life together. What if I want more? Eleanor whispered. What if I'm tired of separate rooms and careful distance? What if I want to try being a real wife to you in every way? Caleb's breath caught audibly. Are you sure? Because Eleanor, if we cross that line, there's no going back. I can't share your bed and then retreat to the guest room and pretend nothing's changed. It would have to mean something. It would mean something, Eleanor said firmly. It would mean I'm choosing you. Not because scandal forced me to, not because I had no other option, but because I want to be your wife. Truly your wife. For a long moment, Caleb just looked at her, as though memorizing every detail of her face in the starlight. Then he cupped her cheek with his hand, his touch gentle, reverent. Are you sure? He asked again. Because I've waited this long. I can wait longer, until you're completely certain. I'm certain that I want to try, that I want to see if this marriage of necessity can become a marriage of choice, of love. Eleanor placed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. Caleb, you've been patient with me, gentle with my fears, understanding of my hesitation. You've proven yourself in every way that matters. I know that I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me, but it also feels right in a way nothing else has in years. Caleb leaned in slowly, giving Eleanor every opportunity to pull back, to change her mind. When she didn't move away, he kissed her. Unlike their brief, chaste kiss at their wedding, this was deep and thorough and full of weeks of restrained longing. Eleanor melted into it, her arms coming up to wind around his neck, and for several perfect moments there was nothing in the world but the two of them, and the stars, and the promise of something beautiful unfolding between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing alone in that town square, facing down a mob with nothing but your dignity and courage. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," Eleanor whispered. "You saved me, Caleb, not just from scandal, but from a life of loneliness and fear. You showed me I could trust again, hope again, maybe even love again." They sat there in the wagon for a few more minutes, holding each other under the vast Colorado sky, before Caleb reluctantly released her and took up the reins again. As they covered the final miles to the ranch, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling. She'd protected her heart for so long, armored herself against further hurt. But Caleb had been patient enough, kind enough, to prove that not all men were like Robert Thornton, that trust could be earned, love could be real, and marriage could be a partnership of equals rather than a trap. When they reached the house, Caleb helped Eleanor down from the wagon and then, without warning, swept her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" Eleanor laughed, clinging to his neck. "Carrying my bride over the threshold, properly this time, the way I should have done on our wedding night." He smiled down at her. "If that's all right with you?" "It's more than all right." He carried her through the door and up the stairs, not to her room, but to his. The guest room he'd occupied for the past month, keeping his promise to respect her boundaries, to give her space and time. But tonight, those boundaries were changing. He set her down gently beside the bed, and Eleanor could see uncertainty flash across his face. "I don't want to rush you." Eleanor pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "You're not rushing me. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us." What happened next was tender and awkward and perfect in its imperfection. Two people learning each other, discovering how to be vulnerable with another person, building intimacy from the foundation of respect and growing love they'd already established. Caleb was gentle and patient, attentive to Eleanor's nervousness, and Eleanor found that with him, there was no shame, no fear, only a sense of rightness that made her wonder how she'd ever thought she could maintain emotional distance from this man. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known in years, maybe ever. "No regrets?" Caleb murmured into her hair. "None. You? How could I have regrets about the best night of my life?" He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I should probably tell you something." Eleanor tensed slightly. "What?" "The real reason I claimed you that day in the town square. It wasn't just about Abigail, though that was part of it. And it wasn't just that I'd been watching you for 4 years, though that was true too." He paused, his heart beating steady beneath her ear. "It was that I'd been trying to work up the courage to court you properly for months before the scandal happened. But you were so independent, so self-contained, and I was just a rough rancher who couldn't string together 2 eloquent sentences around you. I figured I had no chance. Then Constance made her accusations, and suddenly I had an excuse to do what I'd been too afraid to do otherwise, claim you as mine." Eleanor pushed herself up on one elbow to look at him. "You were going to court me?" "Eventually. When I finally grew a backbone and figured out how to approach a brilliant, beautiful schoolteacher without making a fool of myself." He smiled ruefully. "Instead, I made a public declaration in front of the whole town and hoped you'd go along with it. Not my finest strategic moment, I'll admit." "It was the bravest thing anyone's ever done for me," Eleanor said softly. "And the most romantic, though neither of us could acknowledge that at the time. Can we acknowledge it now? We can acknowledge that what started as protection became partnership, and partnership became love." Eleanor kissed him gently. "We can acknowledge that we've built something real from a foundation of necessity. And we can acknowledge that I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with." Caleb pulled her back down against his chest, his arms tightening around her. "Stay with me tonight? And every night after?" "Every night," Eleanor promised. "No more separate rooms, no more careful distance. Just us, building our life together." They fell asleep tangled together, the ring on Eleanor's finger catching the moonlight one last time before darkness claimed the room. Outside, the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, the cattle lowing softly, the horses shifting in their stalls, the wind sighing through the grass. And inside the house, two people who'd been brought together by scandal discovered that sometimes fate knew exactly what it was doing, even when the path seemed impossible. The next morning, Eleanor woke in Caleb's arms with sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and a sense of contentment so profound it almost frightened her. She'd taken the risk, opened her heart, and found that on the other side of fear was something worth having. Caleb stirred beside her, his eyes opening to find her already awake. "Good morning, wife," he said, his voice rough with sleep and happiness. "Good morning, husband." Eleanor traced the line of his jaw with her fingers. "Any regrets in the light of day?" "Only that I didn't build up the courage to claim you sooner." He caught her hand and kissed her palm. "We could have had this months ago if I'd been braver. We have it now. That's what matters." Eleanor nestled closer. "Though we should probably get up. The ranch won't run itself." "The ranch can wait," Caleb said firmly. "My men know how to handle things for a morning. Right now I want to stay here with my wife and appreciate the miracle of her presence in my life." They stayed in bed for another hour, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the future, sharing stories from their pasts. Eleanor told Caleb about her childhood in Boston, about her parents' love for each other, about her dreams of changing the world through education. Caleb told her about growing up in Missouri, about watching his father work himself to death trying to provide for his family, about his determination to build something better. "We're not so different, you and I," Eleanor observed. "Both of us running from painful pasts, both trying to build new lives out west." "Except you're succeeding far better than I am," Caleb said. "You're teaching 32 children to read and think and question. I'm just raising cattle. You're building a legacy, creating something from nothing, employing good men and treating them fairly. That matters, Caleb. That changes lives." Eleanor kissed his shoulder. "Don't diminish what you've accomplished." Eventually, hunger drove them from bed, and they made their way downstairs to find that the ranch hands had already started their day without disturbing the newlyweds. Eleanor blushed at the knowing grins she could imagine on their faces, but Caleb just laughed. "Let them grin. They're probably relieved. James has been making comments for weeks about how patient I was being, waiting for you to be comfortable. I'm pretty sure he and Miguel had a bet going about how long it would take." "Caleb!" Eleanor swatted his arm, mortified. "What? We're a ranch full of men with limited entertainment. Our boss's complicated marriage was the most interesting thing to happen here in years." He pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "But that's over now. Now we're just a normal married couple." "Well, as normal as any couple can be when they started with a fake pregnancy and a public declaration." Eleanor laughed despite her embarrassment. "We are rather unusual." "We're perfect," Caleb corrected. "Perfectly unusual, perfectly matched, perfectly in love." "When did you become such a romantic?" Eleanor teased. "The moment I married you. Turns out having the woman you love actually love you back brings out a man's poetic side." He spun her in a circle in the kitchen, making her laugh. "Now, what do you say we make breakfast together, spend the day working on the ranch, and tonight I'll take you up to the North Ridge and show you the most beautiful sunset view in Colorado?" "I'd say that sounds perfect." And it was perfect. That day and the days that followed, as Eleanor and Caleb settled into their new reality as a truly married couple, the town gossip gradually shifted from speculation about their marriage to acceptance of it. Even Constance Bradley seemed to recognize that she'd lost this particular battle, though Eleanor suspected the woman would never fully forgive her for surviving what should have been social destruction. A month later, as they'd planned, Caleb quietly let it be known that Eleanor had lost the baby. There was genuine sympathy from the townspeople, condolences offered, and then the matter was closed. The original scandal was finally, completely put to rest. Eleanor was simply Mrs. Caleb Rourke now, the school teacher and the rancher's wife. And if their marriage had begun under unusual circumstances, well, that hardly mattered anymore when anyone could see how devoted they were to each other. Eleanor stood at the window of their bedroom now, the guest room converted into a study where she could prepare lessons and Caleb could handle ranch business, and watched her husband working with one of the horses in the corral below. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach and smiled, thinking about the conversation they'd had just that morning. What if? She'd asked as they lay in bed, watching the sunrise. What if the lie became truth? What if we actually had a child? Caleb had pulled her closer, his hand covering hers on her stomach. Then we'd be the luckiest parents in Colorado, and that child would have the smartest, bravest, most beautiful mother in the territory. And the kindest, most honorable father, Eleanor had countered. They weren't trying, not yet. But they weren't preventing it either. And Eleanor had made peace with the irony that the false pregnancy that had nearly destroyed her might someday become a real one that would complete their family. Life, she'd learned, had a strange way of working out. Sometimes disaster became opportunity. Sometimes lies revealed truth. Sometimes a marriage born of necessity became a love story that would last a lifetime. And sometimes when you were brave enough to trust again, when you were willing to take a chance on hope, you found exactly what you'd been searching for all along: a home, a partner, a love that made everything else worth surviving. Eleanor touched the sapphire ring on her finger and smiled. She'd come to Red Hollow 4 years ago, broken and alone, seeking refuge. What she'd found instead was a life, a purpose, and a love she'd never dared to hope for. And it all began with 5 words spoken in a moment of crisis. If she carries, it's mine. Those words had saved her, but the love that followed had healed her. And that, Eleanor thought, was the real miracle. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with fierce determination. By mid-November, snow blanketed the ranch in layers of white that transformed the landscape into something almost otherworldly in its beauty. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window watching fat snowflakes drift past, a cup of tea warming her hands, and marveled at how much her life had changed in just 3 months. 3 months since she'd stood accused in the town square. 3 months since Caleb had claimed her with those 5 impossible words. 3 months since everything she'd thought she knew about her future had been rewritten in ways she could never have imagined. "You're thinking too hard again," Caleb said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I can practically hear the wheels turning in that brilliant mind of yours." Eleanor leaned back against him, savoring his warmth. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. How one moment can change everything. If Constance Bradley hadn't spread that lie, if you hadn't stepped forward when you did, where would I be right now? Probably still teaching, still living alone above the general store, still keeping everyone at arm's length." Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple. "But you're here instead, with me, where you belong." "Where I belong," Eleanor repeated, testing the words. They felt true in a way few things in her life ever had. "Yes, I think I finally believe that." The sound of horses approaching made them both turn toward the window. Through the falling snow, Eleanor could see James Patterson riding up with another man she didn't recognize, someone hunched against the cold, his horse laboring through the drifts. "We've got company," Caleb said, releasing Eleanor and heading for the door. "Stay inside where it's warm. I'll see what this is about." But Eleanor followed him to the porch anyway, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the bitter wind. She watched as James and the stranger dismounted, the latter practically falling from his saddle. "Boss, this is Daniel Cooper from the Morrison Ranch, about 20 miles east," James called out. "His wife's having trouble with the baby. Doc Morrison's snowed in on the other side of Red Hollow, can't get through. Cooper heard you had a wife now and thought maybe she might know about birthing." Eleanor's heart clenched. She'd assisted at exactly 1 birth in her life, her landlady's daughter in Boston, and that had been complicated enough with an experienced midwife present. But looking at Daniel Cooper's desperate face, at the fear and hope warring in his eyes, she knew she couldn't refuse. "How far along is she?" Eleanor asked, already mentally cataloging what they might need. 8 months, maybe a bit more. "The pain started this morning, and they're coming hard and fast now. My Sarah's scared, ma'am. Real scared, and I don't know what to do." Cooper's voice cracked. "Please, I know it's a lot to ask, but I got nowhere else to turn." Eleanor looked at Caleb, who nodded immediately. "We'll go. Both of us. James, saddle up Eleanor's horse and mine. Pack supplies. Blankets, water, whatever we might need. Mrs. Henderson mentioned she keeps a birthing kit at the general store for emergencies. Ride into town and get it." Within 30 minutes, they were riding east through the snowstorm, Cooper leading the way with desperate urgency. Eleanor had changed into her warmest clothes and packed a bag with clean linens, though she had no idea if anything she'd brought would actually be useful. Her heart pounded with anxiety and a strange sense of purpose. A woman needed help. A baby was coming into the world. Whatever her own inexperience, she had to try. The ride seemed endless, though it couldn't have been more than an hour. By the time they reached the Morrison Ranch, a modest homestead dwarfed by the vast white landscape, Eleanor's face was numb from cold and her hands ached even inside her gloves. But she barely noticed her own discomfort as Cooper led them into the small cabin. The scene inside was one of barely controlled chaos. Sarah Cooper lay on a bed in the corner, her face pale and twisted with pain. She couldn't have been more than 19, Eleanor realized with a pang. Just a girl, really, facing one of nature's most dangerous trials with only fear for company. "Sarah, sweetheart, I brought help," Daniel said, rushing to his wife's side. "This is Mrs. Rourke. She's going to help you." Sarah's eyes found Eleanor's, and in them Eleanor saw terror so profound it made her own fears seem insignificant. This girl was facing the very real possibility of death, and she knew it. Childbirth killed women every day on the frontier. Without proper medical care, without experienced hands to guide mother and baby through the process, anything could happen. Eleanor forced confidence into her voice that she didn't feel. "Sarah, my name is Eleanor. I'm going to do everything I can to help you and your baby. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" "It hurts," Sarah gasped as another contraction seized her. "It hurts so much, and something feels wrong. The baby's not moving right. Mrs. Henderson told me it should move down, but it feels like it's stuck." Eleanor's limited knowledge of childbirth flared warning signals. A baby in the wrong position could mean disaster for both mother and child. She looked at Caleb, who'd stayed near the door, and saw her own concern reflected in his eyes. "Daniel, I need you to boil water and find me the cleanest cloths you have," Eleanor said, rolling up her sleeves. "Caleb, help him. Sarah and I need privacy for me to examine her." The men retreated, and Eleanor knelt beside the bed, taking Sarah's hand. "I need to be honest with you. I'm not a midwife. I've only helped with one birth before. But I'm here, and I'm going to do my absolute best for you and your baby. Do you trust me?" Sarah squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "I got no choice but to trust you. And anyway, I can see it in your eyes. You're scared too, but you're not running away. That means something." Over the next several hours, Eleanor discovered reserves of strength and calm she hadn't known she possessed. With Sarah's permission, she examined her and confirmed what she'd feared. The baby was breech, positioned incorrectly for a safe delivery. Eleanor had read about such complications in a medical text she'd borrowed from Doc Morrison months ago, more out of general curiosity than any expectation she'd need the knowledge. Now she frantically tried to recall everything that chapter had said about repositioning breech babies. "Sarah, I'm going to try something," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It might be uncomfortable, but if it works, it'll help your baby turn into the right position. Can you be brave for me?" "I can try," Sarah whispered. What followed was an exercise in blind faith and intuition. Eleanor used techniques she'd only read about, pressing gently but firmly on Sarah's swollen abdomen, trying to encourage the baby to turn. Sarah cried out in pain, and Daniel tried to rush back in, but Caleb held him back, understanding somehow that Eleanor needed to focus without distraction. "Come on, little one," Eleanor murmured, her hands moving with careful precision. "Turn for your mama. Turn so you can come into this world safely." And miraculously, impossibly, she felt the baby shift, felt the small body rotate under her hands until it was positioned correctly. Sarah gasped, and her eyes went wide. "Something changed," she said. "It feels different now, better." Eleanor nearly collapsed with relief. "Your baby turned. You're going to be able to push now when the contractions come. Do you understand? When you feel the next pain, you're going to push with everything you have." The delivery that followed was long and exhausting. Eleanor had never felt so out of her depth, so acutely aware of how much she didn't know. But she stayed calm for Sarah's sake, offering encouragement and guidance, catching the baby when it finally emerged in a rush of blood and fluid. "It's a boy," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with emotion and relief. "Sarah, you have a son." The baby didn't cry at first, and Eleanor's heart stopped. She'd read about this too, babies who needed encouragement to start breathing. With trembling hands, she cleared his mouth and nose, rubbed his tiny back, and silently prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. Then, like a miracle, the baby drew in a shuddering breath and let out a wail that seemed far too loud for such a small creature. Sarah was crying, laughing, reaching for her son. Daniel rushed in, his face a mixture of joy and disbelief, and Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware that her dress was ruined. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she felt like she might faint. Caleb caught her before she fell, guiding her to a chair by the fire. "You did it," he said softly, pride evident in every word. "Eleanor, you saved them both." "I just did what needed doing," Eleanor said, but her voice was shaking. "Caleb, that baby wasn't breathing. For those few seconds I thought, but he is breathing. He's perfect. And his mother is alive and well, because you were brave enough to try." Caleb pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're remarkable. You know that?" Eleanor watched Sarah cradle her newborn son, watched Daniel hover over them both with tears streaming down his weathered face, and felt something shift inside her. She'd helped bring life into the world. She'd faced her fears and discovered she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. They stayed at the Morrison Ranch until the next morning, making sure Sarah and the baby were stable. Eleanor showed Sarah how to nurse, helped her clean up, and made sure the new mother ate something substantial. By the time they finally rode back to their own ranch, the snow had stopped and the world sparkled in brilliant winter sunshine. "You're quiet," Caleb observed as they rode side by side. "I'm thinking about Sarah, about how close we came to losing her, or the baby, or both." Eleanor pulled her coat tighter. "Life is so fragile, Caleb. One wrong move, one moment of bad luck, and everything can fall apart." "But it didn't fall apart. You made sure of that. This time. But what about next time? What if someone else needs help and I don't know enough? What if my luck runs out?" Eleanor could hear the edge of panic in her own voice. Caleb reached over and took her hand. "Then you'll do the best you can, just like you did today. Eleanor, you can't save everyone. No one can. But you can show up and try, which is more than most people do. That's enough." When they arrived home, Eleanor was surprised to find James waiting with news that had apparently traveled faster than they had through the snowy landscape. "Word's already spread about what you did for the Cooper baby," James said, his respect evident. "Folks in town are calling it a miracle. Doc Morrison says he couldn't have done better himself, and he's asking if you'd be willing to help him with difficult cases when they arise." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "I'm not trained. I'm just a teacher who got lucky." "You're a teacher who saved a woman and her baby when no one else could reach them," James corrected. "That's not luck, Mrs. Rourke. That's skill and courage." Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself in unexpected demand. Women began seeking her out for advice about pregnancies, about children's ailments, about medical concerns they were too embarrassed to discuss with Doc Morrison. Eleanor protested that she wasn't qualified, but the women of Red Hollow didn't care. They wanted someone they could trust, someone who'd proven herself under pressure, and Eleanor found herself becoming an informal medical advisor to half the county. She also found herself becoming more deeply integrated into Caleb's life and work. Winter on the ranch was brutal, requiring constant vigilance to keep the cattle fed and safe from predators and storms. Eleanor helped where she could, managing the household, keeping the accounts, cooking for the ranch hands when the weather was too severe for them to make it back to town. She discovered she enjoyed the challenge of ranch life, the physical work and practical problem-solving that complemented her intellectual work at the school. But the greatest change came in her relationship with Caleb. The physical intimacy they'd begun after the harvest dance had deepened into something Eleanor could only describe as profound partnership. They knew each other now in ways that went beyond mere knowledge, the comfort of familiar touch, the shorthand of long-married couples, the ability to communicate with a glance what might take others paragraphs to explain. One evening in early December, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table grading papers while Caleb worked on the ranch ledgers. Snow fell softly outside, and the fire crackled warmly in the stove. It was peaceful, domestic, and Eleanor found herself thinking about the future in ways she'd been afraid to before. "Caleb?" she said, setting down her pen. He didn't look up from his calculations. What if I am pregnant? That got his attention. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. Are you? I don't know yet. It's too early to tell, but it's possible. Eleanor twisted her wedding ring nervously. We've been married 3 months. People will have been counting. If I announce a pregnancy now, some will assume it's the original baby I supposedly lost. Others will think we conceived on our wedding night. Either way, it won't look suspicious. Caleb set down his pen and came around the table to kneel beside her chair. Eleanor, if you're pregnant, it won't be about what looks suspicious or what people think. It'll be about us becoming parents, about bringing a child into our family. Is that something you want? Eleanor met his eyes and found her answer in the hope and love she saw there. Yes, I think it is. I spent so long being afraid of commitment, of vulnerability, of trusting someone enough to build a life with them. But you've shown me that not all men are like Robert Thornton, that marriage can be partnership rather than prison. And watching Sarah with her baby, seeing the love between them, I realized I want that. With you. Caleb's smile was brilliant. Then I hope you are pregnant. And if you're not yet, we'll keep trying until you are. Because Eleanor, the thought of raising children with you, of watching you become a mother, of building a family together, there's nothing I want more. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Eleanor felt the familiar heat rise between them. But before things could progress further, there was a knock at the door, urgent, insistent. Caleb sighed and pulled away reluctantly. I swear, if this is another birthing emergency, I'm going to start charging for your services. But it wasn't a medical emergency. It was Harold Pritchard, looking anxious and apologetic. Mrs. Rourke, Mr. Rourke, I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but there's been a development in town. Constance Bradley has taken ill, seriously ill, from what Doc Morrison says. And she's asking for you, Mrs. Rourke, specifically for you. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Caleb, seeing her own surprise reflected in his face. She wants to see me. Why? I don't know, ma'am, but Doc says it's bad. Pneumonia, probably. In her condition, at her age, Pritchard trailed off, but the implication was clear. Constance might be dying. I'll get my coat, Eleanor said immediately. Caleb caught her arm. Eleanor, you don't owe that woman anything. After what she tried to do to you, I know what she tried to do, but she's sick and asking for help. I can't refuse that, no matter our history. Eleanor touched his cheek gently. It's who I am, Caleb. You know that. I do know that. It's one of the things I love about you. He kissed her forehead. I'm coming with you. They rode into town through the dark and cold, and Eleanor found herself wondering what Constance Bradley could possibly want to say to her. An apology? A final attempt to spread more poison? Some deathbed confession that would explain her cruelty? Constance's house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in an upstairs window. Doc Morrison met them at the door, his expression grave. She's very weak, he said quietly. The pneumonia's advanced. I don't think she'll last the night. She's been asking for you constantly, Mrs. Rourke. Keeps saying she needs to talk to you before it's too late. Eleanor climbed the stairs with Caleb close behind, her heart heavy with complicated emotions. Whatever Constance had done, watching anyone die was difficult, and there was something particularly tragic about dying alone, unmourned, feared rather than loved. The bedroom was stuffy and close, smelling of sickness and medicine. Constance lay in the bed looking small and fragile, nothing like the imposing figure who'd nearly destroyed Eleanor's life. Her breathing was labored, rattling in her chest with each inhalation. Mrs. Bradley? Eleanor said softly, approaching the bed. It's Eleanor Rourke. You asked for me? Constance's eyes opened, and Eleanor was shocked by the clarity in them despite her obvious illness. You came. I didn't think you would, after everything I did to you. You asked for me. That was enough. Eleanor pulled a chair close to the bed. What do you need to tell me? The truth. Constance struggled to sit up, and Eleanor instinctively helped her, adjusting the pillows. The truth about why I tried to ruin you. You deserve to know before I die. Eleanor waited, aware of Caleb standing guard by the door, protective even now. I had a daughter, Constance said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mary. She would have been about your age now. She was beautiful, intelligent, everything a mother could want, and she wanted to be a teacher, just like you. Eleanor's chest tightened, sensing where this was going. But there was a man, a merchant's son who courted her, promised her marriage. She believed him, trusted him, and when she found herself with child, he denied everything, called her a liar. The town, our town in Pennsylvania, they believed him over her, because he was a man, and she was just a girl. Constance's breath hitched. She tried to tell the truth, but no one would listen. She died giving birth to that baby. Alone, disgraced, abandoned by everyone, including me. Including you? Eleanor repeated softly. I was so ashamed, so worried about what people would think of our family. I told her she'd brought the shame on herself, that she should have been more careful, more virtuous. I believed the town over my own daughter. Tears tracked down Constance's weathered cheeks. And then she died, and I realized too late that I'd failed her in the worst way possible. A mother's job is to protect her child, and I sacrificed mine to preserve my own reputation. Eleanor felt tears burning in her own eyes. Mrs. Bradley, after Mary died, I became what you see now, rigid, judgmental, obsessed with other women's moral failings because I couldn't face my own. When I saw you, young, independent, teaching just like Mary wanted to, something in me broke. I convinced myself you must be hiding the same sins my daughter had, that all young women who seem too confident, too free, must be concealing terrible secrets. Constance gripped Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. But you weren't Mary. You were innocent. And I tried to destroy you anyway because I couldn't bear to see you have the life my daughter never got to live. Oh, Constance. Eleanor squeezed the older woman's hand. I'm so sorry about Mary. What happened to her was a terrible injustice. It was. And instead of fighting that injustice, I perpetuated it. I became the very thing that killed my daughter. A society that values reputation over truth, appearance over justice, men's words over women's lives. Constance coughed, a deep rattling sound. I need you to forgive me, Eleanor. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to die knowing that at least one person I tried to destroy was able to forgive me. Eleanor looked at this dying woman who'd caused her such pain and found that the anger she'd carried for months had transformed into something closer to pity. Constance Bradley had been a villain in Eleanor's story, but she'd also been a victim in her own, a mother who'd lost her daughter and never recovered, who'd spent decades projecting her grief and guilt onto innocent women. I forgive you, Eleanor said quietly. For Mary's sake, and for your own. I forgive you, Constance. Constance's eyes closed, tears still streaming. Thank you, thank you. Tell the others, tell them I was wrong about you. Tell them to stop listening to bitter old women who've forgotten how to love. I will, I promise. They sat in silence for a few minutes, Eleanor holding Constance's hand while the older woman's breathing grew more labored. Finally, Constance spoke again, her voice barely audible. You're happy with him? With Caleb Rourke? Very happy. He's a good man. The best I've ever known. Then you got something my Mary never did. A man who chose you, protected you, loved you. Constance's grip weakened. I'm glad. At least some good came from my wickedness. At least I pushed you into the arms of someone who could appreciate what I tried to destroy. Those were the last coherent words Constance Bradley spoke. She drifted into unconsciousness shortly after and died just before dawn with Eleanor still holding her hand. Doc Morrison pronounced her dead, and Eleanor closed the woman's eyes with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. You didn't have to do that, Caleb said quietly as they left the house. Stay with her. Comfort her. She didn't deserve your kindness. Maybe not, but I deserve to give it. Eleanor leaned into him as they walked to their wagon. Her daughter didn't deserve what happened to her. Constance didn't deserve to die alone and unforgiven. And I didn't deserve to carry anger in my heart when forgiveness was possible. So I forgave her, not for her sake, but for mine. Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders. You're a better person than I am. No, I'm just someone who understands that hurt people hurt people. Constance was broken by her daughter's death, and she spent the rest of her life making other women pay for her own failures. That's tragic, not evil, and I can forgive tragedy even when I can't forget it. Word of Constance's deathbed confession spread through Red Hollow with the same speed her original accusations had. The women who'd followed her lead, who'd helped spread the lies about Eleanor, came forward one by one to apologize. The town's perception of Eleanor shifted again. Now she wasn't just Caleb Rourke's wife or the brave schoolteacher, but a woman with enough grace to forgive her tormentor. At Constance's funeral, sparsely attended by a town that had feared rather than loved her, Eleanor was asked to say a few words. She stood before the small gathering and spoke not about Constance's cruelty, but about her daughter Mary, about the injustice that had broken a mother's heart, about the importance of believing women and protecting the vulnerable. Constance Bradley made mistakes, Eleanor said, her voice carrying in the quiet church. She hurt people, including me. But she also lost a daughter to the same kind of judgment and condemnation she later inflicted on others. Let's honor her memory not by forgetting what she did, but by learning from it. Let's build a community where women are believed, where young people are protected, where reputation matters less than character and gossip matters less than truth. After the funeral, several women approached Eleanor with stories of their own, times when Constance had targeted them or their daughters, spreading rumors that had caused real harm. Eleanor listened to each one, recognizing that Constance's damage had been wider and deeper than she'd realized. "We should do something," Martha Collins said. "Something to make sure this doesn't happen again. That women like Constance can't destroy lives with lies. Or that women like Mary get the support they need," Sarah Cooper added, her baby in her arms, "so they don't have to face judgment alone." An idea began forming in Eleanor's mind. What if we started a women's group? A place where we could support each other, share knowledge, help with medical issues and childcare, and anything else that comes up. A community within the community. Like a society? Martha asked. Exactly like a society. The Red Hollow Women's Society. Eleanor warmed to the idea. We could meet weekly, share skills, support each other through difficult times. And if someone faces the kind of judgment I faced, or that Mary faced, we could stand together, make sure no woman has to face that alone. The idea took root quickly. Within a week, 15 women had pledged to join. Within a month, the Red Hollow Women's Society held its first official meeting in the church hall, with Eleanor serving as founding president. They established guidelines: no gossip, no judgment, support and education above all else. They created a lending library, started a fund to help women in financial distress, and began offering education on health and childcare issues. Caleb watched his wife's transformation with proud amazement. The woman who'd arrived in Red Hollow 4 years ago seeking refuge had become a community leader, someone who not only survived persecution, but used it as fuel to create positive change. "You're changing this town," he told her one evening as they prepared for bed. "Making it better, kinder, safer for women." "We're changing it," Eleanor corrected. "This wouldn't have been possible without you. Without your protection when I needed it, your support as I found my footing, your encouragement to be more than just a survivor." Caleb pulled her into his arms. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you?" "Not in the last hour. I was starting to worry." Eleanor smiled against his chest. "I love you. I love your strength and your compassion and your ability to turn pain into purpose. I love watching you teach children and comfort mothers and stand up to anyone who threatens the people you care about. I love—" He stopped, his hand moving to rest on her stomach. "Eleanor, are you—" Eleanor placed her hand over his and met his eyes. "I think so. I'm about 6 weeks late, and I've been feeling strange in the mornings. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, but yes, Caleb, I think I'm pregnant." The joy that flooded Caleb's face was almost painful in its intensity. He swept Eleanor up in his arms, spinning her carefully, his laugh echoing through their bedroom. "We're having a baby, a real baby. Eleanor, we're going to be parents." "Ironic, isn't it?" Eleanor said when he finally set her down. "The lie that nearly destroyed me is becoming truth. The false pregnancy is becoming real." "Not ironic, poetic, full circle." Caleb cradled her face in his hands. "We're going to have a child born of love, raised in truth, surrounded by a community we've helped build. That's not irony, Eleanor. That's grace. Eleanor thought about everything that had led to this moment. Constance's accusation, Caleb's impossible claim, their marriage of convenience that became a marriage of love. She thought about Sarah Cooper's baby that she'd helped deliver, about Constance's daughter Mary, who never got to live her dreams, about all the women who'd been destroyed by lies and judgment throughout history. And she thought about the life growing inside her, the child who would be born into a world that was still imperfect, but perhaps slightly better than the one Eleanor had inherited. A child who would have two parents who loved each other, who chose each other, who built something real from the foundation of scandal and necessity. Yes, she said softly. Grace. That's exactly what it is. They made love that night with a tenderness born of shared joy and wonder, celebrating not just the baby but everything they'd survived and overcome to reach this point. And when Eleanor finally drifted off to sleep in Caleb's arms, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, she felt a peace and contentment she'd never imagined possible. The lie that had nearly destroyed her had led her to the greatest truth of her life, that love, real love, was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of uncertainty, and that sometimes the darkest moments preceded the brightest dawns. Spring came to Red Hollow with explosive beauty, as though nature itself was celebrating Eleanor's pregnancy. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riots of purple and yellow, the trees burst into new leaf, and the air smelled of growth and possibility. Eleanor stood on the porch of the ranch house, one hand resting on her now prominent belly, watching Caleb work with a new colt in the corral. At 7 months pregnant, she'd finally agreed to step back from some of her more strenuous activities, though she still taught 3 days a week and ran the Women's Society meetings with characteristic determination. "Mrs. Rourke, you really shouldn't be standing so long," James Patterson called out, riding up with a concerned expression. "Boss will have my hide if anything happens to you or that baby." Eleanor laughed. "James, women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I think I can manage standing on my own porch." "Maybe so, but the boss is particular about you. We all are." James dismounted and came to stand at a respectful distance. "The whole territory's invested in this baby now, you know. Folks are taking bets on whether it's a boy or girl, making blankets and carving toys. You and Mr. Rourke, you've become something of a legend around these parts." "A legend?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That seems excessive." "Maybe to you, but think about it from our perspective. A woman falsely accused, a man who stepped up to defend her, a marriage that became real love, and now a baby that proves the whole thing wasn't a scandal at all, but a love story in disguise." James grinned. "People eat that stuff up. Makes them believe good things can happen even in hard times." Eleanor considered his words as he rode off to join the other hands. She supposed he was right. In a place where life was brutal and unpredictable, where drought and disease and pure bad luck could destroy everything you'd built, people needed stories of hope. Stories where things worked out, where love conquered adversity, where false accusations transformed into true blessings. The irony wasn't lost on her. The pregnancy that had nearly destroyed her reputation before it existed was now the crown jewel in a narrative of redemption. But Eleanor had learned to embrace irony over the past months. Life rarely unfolded the way you planned, and fighting that truth was exhausting. Better to accept it, work with it, and find meaning in the unexpected turns. "You look thoughtful," Caleb said, climbing the porch steps and pulling her into a careful embrace. His hand found her belly automatically, feeling for the baby's movements. "And this little one is active today." "Very active. I think we're having a dancer." Eleanor leaned back against him, savoring his solid warmth. "James says we've become a legend." James talks too much, but Caleb's tone was affectionate. Though he's not entirely wrong, people do seem invested in our story. "It's strange, isn't it? How the worst day of my life led to the best thing that ever happened to me." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward. If you'd let Constance destroy me and just gone on with your life. I couldn't have done that. Even if I hadn't already been half in love with you, I couldn't have stood by and watched another woman be destroyed by lies." Caleb kissed her forehead. but I'm grateful every day that I found the courage to claim you, because everything good in my life now traces back to that moment. A kick from the baby interrupted their conversation, strong enough that Caleb felt it through Eleanor's dress. His face lit up with the wonder that still appeared every time their child made its presence known. Strong, he said approvingly, takes after his mother. Or her father. Eleanor had long since given up trying to guess the baby's gender. Caleb alternated between convinced certainty it was a boy and equally convinced certainty it was a girl, depending on his mood. Eleanor suspected he'd be thrilled either way. The sound of a wagon approaching made them both turn. To Eleanor's surprise, she saw Harold Pritchard driving, with several other members of the school board seated behind him. Her heart sank slightly. She'd agreed to continue teaching through her 6th month, but had stepped back after that, and she hoped they weren't coming to pressure her to return before the baby arrived. "Mr. and Mrs. Rourke," Pritchard said, climbing down from the wagon with unusual formality. "We hope we're not intruding, but we have some business to discuss with you." "Of course." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Caleb, who looked equally puzzled. "Would you like to come inside?" The delegation filed into the house. Pritchard, Samuel Blackwood the lawyer, Reverend Walsh, and surprisingly, Sarah Morton's father George, who'd recently been elected to the board. Eleanor served coffee while the men settled themselves in the main room, their expressions serious but not hostile. "Mrs. Rourke," Pritchard began, "we'll get straight to the point. The board has been discussing the future of education in Red Hollow, particularly given the town's growth over the past year. We've gone from 30 students to nearly 50, with more families moving to the area every month." "That's wonderful," Eleanor said cautiously, unsure where this was going. "It is wonderful, but it means one teacher can no longer adequately serve the community's needs. We need to expand the school, hire additional teachers, and improve our facilities." Pritchard leaned forward. "We'd like to offer you the position of headmistress, overseeing the entire educational program. You'd hire and train new teachers, develop curriculum, and essentially shape the future of education in Red Hollow." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. This was the last thing she'd expected. "Of course, we understand you'll need time after the baby arrives," Blackwood added quickly. "We're prepared to hire an interim teacher for the next few months while you recover, but we want to know if you'd be interested in taking on this expanded role when you're ready." "Why me?" Eleanor asked. "I'm competent, but surely there are more experienced educators." "There's no one more qualified," George Morton interrupted. "Mrs. Rourke, you've not only taught our children exceptionally well, you've also started a women's society that's improving lives across the county, helped deliver babies when the doctor couldn't get there, and brought this community together in ways we never managed before. You have vision, courage, and the respect of everyone in Red Hollow. You're exactly who we need leading our schools into the future." Eleanor looked at Caleb, who was smiling with obvious pride. "It's your decision, Eleanor, but for what it's worth, I think you'd be extraordinary in that role." "I'd need to hire good teachers," Eleanor said slowly, her mind already spinning with possibilities. "People who genuinely care about children, not just those looking for easy work. And I'd want to expand the curriculum beyond basic reading and arithmetic, science, literature, even Latin for students who show aptitude." "Whatever you think is best," Pritchard said. "We're prepared to support your vision, Mrs. Rourke. Red Hollow is growing into a real town, and we need educational opportunities that reflect that growth." Eleanor thought about the girl she'd been in Boston, dreaming of making a difference through education. She thought about the woman who'd arrived in Red Hollow 4 years ago, broken and seeking refuge. And she thought about who she'd become, stronger, braver, more capable than she'd ever imagined possible. "I accept," she said, "with the understanding that I'll need several months after the baby arrives before I can take on the full responsibilities. But yes, I accept your offer." The men broke into smiles, shaking her hand and Caleb's, discussing logistics and timelines. After they left, Eleanor sat down heavily, her hand on her belly, trying to process what had just happened. "Headmistress," she said wonderingly. "They want me to be headmistress." "Of course they do. You're brilliant, dedicated, and you've proven you can handle anything life throws at you." Caleb knelt beside her chair. "Are you happy about this?" "I'm terrified and thrilled in equal measure. What if I fail? What if I can't manage being headmistress and a mother?" Then you'll figure it out, the way you figure everything out. Eleanor, you've turned every obstacle into an opportunity. You'll do the same with this. He kissed her hand. And you won't be alone. I'll help however I can. We're partners, remember? Partners, Eleanor repeated, warmth flooding through her. Yes, we are. The next 2 months passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor worked with the school board to design plans for the expanded school, interviewed potential teachers through correspondence with educational institutions back east, and slowly assembled a vision for what Red Hollow's educational system could become. She also prepared for the baby with help from the Women's Society, which had grown to include nearly 40 members. They held a celebration for Eleanor, presenting her with handmade baby clothes, carved toys, and enough practical advice to fill several books. "You're going to be a wonderful mother," Martha Collins said, hugging Eleanor carefully. "This baby is lucky to have you." "I hope so. I'm certainly going to try my best." Eleanor touched her belly, feeling the now familiar movements of her child. "Though I'll admit, the reality of actually having a baby is starting to sink in, and it's somewhat terrifying." "Every mother feels that way," Sarah Cooper assured her, bouncing her own 6-month-old son on her hip. "But then you hold your baby for the first time, and suddenly you understand why women have been doing this since the beginning of time. It's worth every moment of fear and pain." Eleanor clung to those words 2 weeks later when her labor began in the middle of a warm June night. She woke to cramping that quickly intensified into unmistakable contractions and shook Caleb awake with trembling hands. "It's time," she said simply. Caleb was up instantly, his earlier nervousness transforming into calm efficiency. He'd been preparing for this moment for months, ensuring they had everything they might need, that Doc Morrison knew to be available at a moment's notice, that the ranch hands knew to fetch help if required. But as it turned out, they didn't need much help. Doc Morrison arrived within an hour, examined Eleanor, and pronounced everything progressing normally. The Women's Society members appeared throughout the morning, Martha to help with practical matters, Sarah to offer encouragement based on her recent experience. Even young Sarah Morton, now 17, who'd expressed interest in possibly becoming a nurse someday. The labor was long and exhausting, lasting well into the afternoon. Eleanor discovered that all her preparations, all her reading about childbirth, and her single experience helping Sarah Cooper had not quite prepared her for the reality of bringing her own child into the world. The pain was intense, all-consuming, and there were moments when she genuinely wondered if she'd survive. But Caleb never left her side. He held her hand through every contraction, encouraged her when she was certain she couldn't continue, and loved her through every moment of the ordeal. And when Doc Morrison finally said it was time to push, when Eleanor gathered every scrap of strength she possessed and brought their child into the world, it was Caleb's face she focused on, his love, his faith in her, his unshakable presence. "It's a girl," Doc Morrison announced, holding up a squalling, red-faced infant. "A healthy baby girl." Eleanor barely heard him. Her entire focus was on the baby. Doc Morrison was cleaning and wrapping in a soft blanket. Her daughter. Her and Caleb's daughter. The impossible become possible, the lie transformed into truth, the scandal that had nearly destroyed her now manifested as the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Doc Morrison placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, and time seemed to stop. The infant's cries quieted as she felt her mother's warmth, and her eyes, dark blue and unfocused, opened to regard Eleanor with what seemed like ancient wisdom. "Hello, little one," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world." Caleb leaned over them both, his own eyes suspiciously bright. His finger traced their daughter's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers closed around it with surprising strength. "She's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Eleanor, she's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked, unable to look away from her daughter's face. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What about Mary? After Constance's daughter, the one who never got to live her dreams. This Mary will have everything her namesake was denied: love, support, education, freedom." Eleanor looked up at her husband, this man who'd saved her and then loved her, and now wanted to honor a woman he'd never met because her story deserved remembrance. "Mary Abigail Rourke," she said, "for both the women who should have had better lives. Our daughter will carry their names into a better future." Mary Abigail Rourke, Caleb repeated, testing the name. It's perfect. Word of the baby's arrival spread through Red Hollow with characteristic speed. By evening, the ranch house was full of visitors, ranch hands who wanted to congratulate their boss, women's society members who came bearing food and gifts, students from Eleanor's classroom who were excited to meet their teacher's baby. Even Harold Pritchard and Reverend Walsh stopped by, the latter to offer a blessing over the infant. Eleanor, exhausted but radiantly happy, received them all from her bed while Caleb stood guard, making sure no one overstayed or tired his wife too much. Mary slept peacefully through most of it, occasionally waking to nurse and then drifting back to sleep with the easy contentment of a loved child. As the visitors finally departed and night fell, Eleanor found herself alone with Caleb and their daughter. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, cradling Mary with the careful reverence of a man holding something infinitely precious. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A wife I love, a daughter, a real family. After Abigail died, after I watched my mother grieve herself to death, I thought this kind of happiness wasn't possible for me. And I never thought I could trust anyone enough to build this kind of life," Eleanor replied. "After Robert, after Boston, I'd convinced myself that independence was safer than vulnerability. But you showed me I was wrong." Caleb carefully returned Mary to Eleanor's arms. "Do you remember what I said that first night in the kitchen? That if there was a baby, it was mine? How could I forget? Those 5 words changed my entire life. I've been thinking about those words a lot lately, about how I claimed a baby that didn't exist to save you from scandal, and now here we are with a real baby, one that actually is mine, ours." He shook his head in wonder. "The universe has a strange sense of humor. Or a strange sense of justice," Eleanor suggested. "Maybe this is how things were always supposed to work out. All the pain and scandal and fear were just the path we had to walk to get here." Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Caleb settled into the rhythms of new parenthood. Mary was a relatively easy baby. She nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and seemed content to be passed between her parents and the various people who came to visit. Eleanor had worried about balancing motherhood with her other responsibilities, but she discovered that with Caleb's help and the support of the Women's Society, it was more manageable than she'd feared. 6 weeks after Mary's birth, Eleanor received a letter that would change the trajectory of her work in unexpected ways. It was from a women's education organization in Denver, asking if she'd be willing to speak at their annual conference about her experiences building community support systems for women in rural areas. The Women's Society had apparently gained attention beyond Red Hollow, and other communities wanted to learn from their model. "You should go," Caleb said immediately when Eleanor showed him the letter. "This is important work, Eleanor. Other women need to hear your story, learn from what you've built." "But, Mary, will be fine with me for a few days. I've become quite adept at baby care, if I do say so myself." He took Mary from Eleanor's arms and bounced her gently, earning a gurgling laugh from the infant. "See? We'll manage beautifully. You go to Denver, share your wisdom, and come back with new ideas for how to make Red Hollow even better." So Eleanor went to Denver, leaving her daughter for the first time since her birth, and discovering that she was both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect of reclaiming a piece of her professional identity separate from motherhood. The conference was eye-opening. Dozens of women working on various reform efforts, from voting rights to education to labor conditions. Eleanor spoke about the Women's Society, about creating support networks that empowered women without threatening the men who might otherwise oppose such efforts. Her speech was received with enthusiastic applause, and afterward, several women approached her with questions and ideas. One was a reporter from a Denver newspaper who asked if she could write an article about Eleanor's story, the false accusation, Caleb's dramatic intervention, their unconventional marriage that became genuine partnership, and the work Eleanor was now doing to help other women. Eleanor hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of her private life becoming public entertainment. But then she thought about Constance's daughter Mary, about Sarah Cooper, and all the other women who'd been destroyed or nearly destroyed by similar circumstances. If her story could help change the narrative, could make people think twice before believing malicious gossip, wasn't that worth the discomfort? "You can write the article," she agreed. But make sure you emphasize that the real story isn't about scandal or romance. It's about community, about people choosing to support each other rather than tear each other down. That's what actually matters. The article ran a month later, and copies of it found their way back to Red Hollow. Eleanor cringed reading it. The reporter had definitely emphasized the romantic elements more than Eleanor would have liked, with flowery language about the cowboy who claimed her and a love born from adversity. But the core message was there too: information about the Women's Society and the importance of believing women and supporting community-based solutions to social problems. More importantly, the article inspired action. Eleanor began receiving letters from women in other towns and territories asking for advice on starting their own support societies. She corresponded with them, sharing what had worked in Red Hollow and learning from their own experiences. The network grew slowly but steadily, connections forming between women who'd previously been isolated in their struggles. "You're building something remarkable," Caleb told her one evening as she worked on letters at the kitchen table while Mary slept in a cradle nearby. "A movement, really, all because you refuse to let one woman's cruelty defeat you." "It's not just me. It's all of us. Every woman who's been brave enough to speak up, to support others, to demand better. I'm just one person in a much larger effort." Eleanor set down her pen and looked at her husband. "But I couldn't do any of it without you. Without your support, your encouragement, your willingness to take on extra work, so I have time for these projects." "That's what partnership means," Caleb said simply. "Your success is my success. Your dreams matter as much as mine, probably more, since your dreams actually help people beyond our immediate family." As Mary's first birthday approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since that terrible day in the town square. It seemed impossible that only 15 months had passed. In that time, she'd married a near stranger, lost her greatest enemy, discovered love, given birth, been promoted to head mistress, and become an unlikely advocate for women's rights. Her life had transformed so completely that sometimes she hardly recognized the frightened woman she'd been. The Women's Society organized a joint celebration, Mary's birthday and the one-year anniversary of the society's founding. Nearly the entire town attended, gathering at the church hall that had once been the site of Eleanor and Caleb's hasty wedding. Eleanor stood before the crowd with Mary in her arms and Caleb at her side, overwhelmed by the sight of so many people who'd become her community, her support system, her chosen family. "A year ago," she began, "many of you didn't know whether to trust me. I was at the center of a scandal, married under suspicious circumstances, and trying to rebuild a reputation that had been shattered by lies. I won't pretend that was easy. There were days when I wanted to give up, to leave Red Hollow, and start over somewhere no one knew my name." She paused, looking around at familiar faces. "But I stayed. And I stayed because of people in this room who chose to give me a second chance. People who decided that gossip and scandal mattered less than character and contribution. People who believed in redemption and second acts." Eleanor's eyes found Sarah Cooper, holding her toddler son. "I stayed because women like Sarah trusted me to help in their most vulnerable moments. I stayed because men like my husband proved that not all men see women's independence as threatening. I stayed because this community, for all its flaws, was willing to grow and change and become better than it had been." She shifted Mary to her other hip, and the baby grabbed at the locket Eleanor wore, a gift from Caleb containing a tiny photograph of the three of them. "This little girl will grow up in a Red Hollow that's different from the one I first encountered. She'll grow up knowing that women can be teachers and leaders and voices of change. She'll grow up in a community that values truth over gossip, compassion over judgment, and justice over reputation. And she'll grow up because all of you chose to make that possible." The applause was thunderous. Eleanor blinked back tears as people came forward to congratulate her, to thank her for her leadership, to share their own stories of how the Women's Society had helped them. She saw former students, now young adults, who credited her teaching with giving them opportunities they'd never imagined. She saw women who'd been on the verge of leaving abusive situations but had found the support to build new lives. She saw men who'd learned to see their wives and daughters as partners rather than property. Later, as the celebration wound down and people headed home, Eleanor stood outside with Caleb, watching the sun set over the mountains. Mary had fallen asleep against her shoulder, warm and solid and real. "Do you ever think about that day in the town square?" Caleb asked quietly. About what would have happened if things had gone differently. Sometimes, usually when I'm feeling particularly grateful for how things actually turned out. Eleanor leaned into him. If you hadn't stepped forward, I would have left Red Hollow, probably gone to California or Oregon, started over under a false name, spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder and afraid to trust anyone. And I would have stayed here, running my ranch, growing old alone, never knowing what I was missing. Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders. We saved each other, Eleanor. That's the real story. Not that I rescued you from scandal, but that we rescued each other from loneliness and fear and lives half-lived. You know what the most ironic part is? Eleanor shifted Mary to a more comfortable position. Constance Bradley thought she was destroying me when she started that rumor, but she actually set in motion everything good in my life. If she hadn't falsely accused me, you never would have claimed me. We never would have married. Mary wouldn't exist. The Women's Society wouldn't exist. None of this would have happened. I'd like to think we would have found each other eventually, Caleb said. That I would have worked up the courage to court you properly. That you would have given me a chance despite your past hurts. Maybe. But this way makes for a better story, Eleanor smiled. The scandalous false pregnancy that became a beautiful truth. The cowboy who claimed what wasn't his and made it real through sheer force of love and commitment. The marriage of convenience that became the love story of Red Hollow. Speaking of which, Caleb said, pulling a folded newspaper from his pocket. This came in the mail today. That reporter in Denver? Apparently her article got picked up by papers across the territory. We're famous, Eleanor. Eleanor unfolded the paper and read the headline. From Scandal to Salvation, the true story of Red Hollow's most unlikely romance. She skimmed the article, which was surprisingly accurate and even included quotes from some of their friends in town. Good grief, she muttered. People are going to think we planned this whole thing as some elaborate romantic gesture. Would that be so bad? Let them think whatever they want. We know the truth, that we stumbled into love and grace and built something beautiful from the wreckage of other people's cruelty. Caleb took the paper from her hands and tossed it aside. Besides, I rather like being known as the cowboy who loved you enough to claim you in front of the entire town. Makes me sound heroic. You are heroic, just not in the way that article suggests. Eleanor stood on her toes to kiss him. You're heroic in the everyday ways that matter. Getting up before dawn to feed cattle, changing diapers without complaint, supporting my work even when it means extra burden for you, teaching our daughter that women are equal partners rather than property. Well, when you put it that way, I suppose I am pretty impressive. Caleb grinned. Come on, let's get our impressive daughter inside before she wakes up and demands food. They walked back to the ranch house together, Mary sleeping peacefully between them. Inside, Caleb built up the fire while Eleanor nursed the baby and then tucked her into the cradle they'd placed in their bedroom. These small domestic rituals had become precious to Eleanor, the ordinary moments that made up a life, that added up to happiness in ways grand gestures never could. As she and Caleb prepared for bed, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Not because she'd changed physically, though motherhood in time had added softness and confidence to her features, but because the woman looking back at her was so completely different from the frightened, defensive person she'd been 15 months ago, that Eleanor had been all sharp edges and protective armor, ready to flinch at the first sign of judgment. This Eleanor was softer but stronger, open but not vulnerable, trusting without being naive. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. About transformation, about how much can change in such a short time, about grace. Eleanor covered his hands with hers, about how the worst day of my life led to the best life I could have imagined. Poetic justice, Caleb murmured, kissing her neck. The lie that nearly destroyed you became the truth that saved you. Saved us both, Eleanor corrected. You were as lost as I was, Caleb, hiding from grief and guilt, working yourself to exhaustion to avoid feeling anything. We healed each other. They stood there for a long moment, watching their reflection in the mirror, a man and woman who'd found each other in the most improbable circumstances and built something real and lasting from the foundation of scandal and necessity. In the cradle beside their bed, Mary stirred and made a small sound before settling back into sleep. Their daughter, their miracle, their impossible blessing. The years that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. Eleanor took up her position as head mistress and transformed Red Hollow's educational system into one of the finest in the territory. The Women's Society expanded its reach and impact, becoming a model that other communities studied and emulated. Mary grew into a bright, curious child who loved books and horses in equal measure and who absorbed her parents' values of justice, compassion, and community. 2 years after Mary's birth, Eleanor and Caleb welcomed a son they named Thomas, after Caleb's father. 3 years after that came twin daughters, Grace and Hope, names that reflected what their parents had found in each other. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, and the land itself prospered under Caleb's careful stewardship. But through all the changes and growth, one thing remained constant: the story of how Eleanor and Caleb came together. It became part of Red Hollow's folklore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions emphasized the romance, others the scandal, still others the social reform that followed. But all versions agreed on the essential truth: that love could bloom in the most unlikely soil, that redemption was possible even from the deepest shame, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives were actually invitations to something better. 20 years after that day in the town square, Eleanor stood once again before the Red Hollow community. But this time, she was dedicating a new building, the Mary Bradley Memorial School, named for the young woman whose tragic death had set so much in motion. The school was large and modern, with separate classrooms for different age groups, a library that would have made Caleb's mother proud, and facilities for teaching everything from basic literacy to advanced sciences. This school stands as a testament to what communities can build when they choose compassion over judgment, Eleanor said, addressing the crowd that included several territorial officials and education reformers from across the West. Mary Bradley never got to live her dreams of becoming a teacher, but her story helped spark a movement that has touched countless lives. This school, and the education it will provide, is our way of honoring her memory and ensuring that no young person's dreams are destroyed by cruelty and lies. Among the crowd, Eleanor could see her own children: Mary at 19, already training to become a teacher herself; Thomas at 17, planning to study law and work for women's suffrage; the 13-year-old twins still undecided about their futures but growing up with opportunities their mother had only dreamed of at their age. And beside them stood Caleb, grayer now, but still strong, still steady, still the man who'd changed her life with 5 impossible words. After the ceremony, as people milled about admiring the new school, a young woman approached Eleanor nervously. She was perhaps 22, dressed in traveling clothes that had seen better days, and there was something in her eyes that Eleanor recognized: fear, shame, determination, all mixed together. "Mrs. Rourke, I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard about your story, about what happened to you 20 years ago, and how you survived it." The young woman's voice was barely above a whisper. "Something similar happened to me in my town. False accusations, scandal, everyone believing the worst. I had to leave. But I heard that Red Hollow was different, that women who'd faced situations like mine could find refuge here." Eleanor's heart ached with recognition and purpose. How many times over the years had she seen this same scene play out? Desperate women arriving in Red Hollow, looking for the safety and support that the Women's Society now provided? How many lives had been rebuilt because one community decided to choose compassion over condemnation? "What's your name?" Eleanor asked gently. "Catherine. Catherine Wells." "Well, Catherine Wells, you've come to the right place. We have resources to help you find housing and employment. We have a community of women who understand what you've been through and won't judge you for it. And we have hope, which is sometimes the most important thing." Eleanor took the young woman's hand. "You're not alone anymore. You're home." As Eleanor helped Catherine connect with Women's Society members who could assist her, she felt Caleb's presence at her elbow. She glanced up at him and saw the same emotion in his eyes that she felt in her heart: gratitude for the life they'd built, pride in what they'd accomplished, and deep satisfaction in knowing that their story had made it possible for others to write new endings to similar stories. That evening, the whole family gathered at the ranch for dinner. It was chaotic and noisy, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously, children arguing good-naturedly about everything from politics to horse breeding, and the warm smell of Eleanor's cooking filling the house. Mary held her newest sibling, baby Samuel, born 6 months earlier and completing what Eleanor had declared was definitely their last addition to the family, while helping set the table. Thomas regaled them with stories from his apprenticeship with Samuel Blackwood. The twins competed to see who could make their father laugh harder with increasingly outrageous tales. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, and felt overwhelmed by the sheer improbable beauty of it all. This life, this family, this community, none of it should have been possible. By all rights, she should have been destroyed by Constance Bradley's lies, should have left Red Hollow in disgrace, should have spent the rest of her life alone and bitter and afraid. Instead, she had this, all of this, the miracle of the everyday. "Mama, are you crying?" Grace asked, appearing at Eleanor's elbow with the intuitive concern of a 13-year-old daughter. "Happy tears," Eleanor assured her, wiping her eyes. "Just thinking about how lucky I am." "We're the lucky ones," Mary said, joining them with baby Samuel gurgling in her arms. "Growing up with parents who love each other, who built something meaningful, who showed us that setbacks can become opportunities. Not everyone gets that." "No, they don't," Eleanor agreed, thinking of young Catherine Wells and all the women like her, which is why it's important to extend that luck to others whenever we can. Dinner was raucous and joyful, full of laughter and spirited debate, and the particular warmth that comes from people who genuinely love and enjoy each other's company. After the meal, as the children cleaned up and then dispersed to their various evening activities, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains just as they had so many times before. 20 years, Caleb said, taking Eleanor's hand. 20 years since I stood in that town square and claimed you as mine. 20 years of partnership, love, and building something that matters. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you have any regrets?" "Only that I didn't claim you sooner." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "And that I wasted so many years before you arrived, living half a life because I was too afraid to hope for more." "We found each other when we were meant to," Eleanor said. "Any sooner, and we might not have been ready to appreciate what we had." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Inside the house, they could hear their children's voices, arguing, laughing, living the secure, confident lives that were possible because their parents had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, truth over scandal. "You know what I think about sometimes," Eleanor said, "about that moment in the town square when you stepped forward, about the split second between you seeing me standing there alone and you deciding to act. What went through your mind in that moment?" Caleb was quiet for a long time, remembering. "I saw you standing there, surrounded by judgment, and I saw Abigail. I saw my sister in her final days, destroyed by lies she couldn't disprove. And I saw every woman who'd ever been condemned by a society that valued reputation over truth, and I thought, not this time. Not again. This time someone will stand up. This time someone will fight." And then you said the words that changed everything. "If she carries, it's mine." Caleb smiled at the memory. 5 words that I barely thought through, that I just blurted out because I couldn't stand by and do nothing. 5 words that gave you back your dignity, gave me a purpose beyond just running a ranch, and gave us a future neither of us had dared to hope for. 5 words that became a love story, Eleanor added, and a family, and a movement, and a legacy that will outlive us both. As darkness settled over the ranch and stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky, Eleanor thought about legacy, about what they would leave behind when their time came. The ranch would continue, passed down through their children. The school would educate generations of students. The Women's Society would evolve and adapt, but would continue its essential work of supporting women and building community. Their children would carry forward the values they'd learned, spreading ripples of compassion and justice into an uncertain future. But more than any specific institution or achievement, Eleanor and Caleb would leave behind a story. The story of a woman falsely accused and a man who defended her. The story of a marriage that began in necessity and blossomed into deep, abiding love. The story of a community that chose to be better than its worst impulses. And the story of how grace can emerge from the wreckage of cruelty. How love can redeem what seemed irredeemable. And how sometimes the hardest moments become the hinges upon which entire lives turn toward light. If she carries, it's mine, Eleanor repeated softly, tasting the words that had defined so much of her life. You claimed something that wasn't yours and made it real through love and commitment. You claimed me, and in doing so, you saved us both. I claimed you, Caleb agreed. But you're the one who made it matter. You took that impulsive declaration and built a life worth living from it. You turned scandal into strength, fear into courage, and isolation into community. That's all you, Eleanor. That's your grace. They sat together on that porch until the stars filled the sky and the house grew quiet as their children settled for the night. And when they finally went inside, it was with the deep contentment of people who'd found their place in the world, who'd built something meaningful from unpromising materials, who'd proven that love, real love, chosen love, committed love, could overcome anything. The story that had begun with a lie ended with truth. The scandal that had threatened to destroy became the foundation for creation. And the 5 words spoken in a moment of crisis became the motto for a life well lived. If she carries, it's mine. Meaning, I claim her, I protect her, I choose her, I love her, and I will build a future where she and all women like her can live with dignity and freedom and hope. In Red Hollow, in the territory of Colorado, in the year 1895, that story was still being told. And it would continue to be told for generations to come, inspiring courage in those who needed it, offering hope to those who despaired, and reminding everyone who heard it that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are really just invitations to grace. Eleanor and Caleb's story was complete, but its echoes would continue forever, rippling outward through time and space, touching lives they would never know, changing the world in ways both large and small. Because that's what love does. It transforms not just the people who experience it, but everyone those people touch, creating circles of grace that expand endlessly into the future. And it all began with 5 words. If she carries, it's mine.